The ancient Greeks had a name for a land beyond the frozen north. They called it Hyperborea, a place where the sun never set and people never aged. 3,000 miles away, Sanskrit texts described the same place. They called it something else, but the details matched perfectly. Hyperborea. The word itself carries weight across millennia. In Greek, it means beyond the north wind, beyond Boreas, the savage deity who brought winter storms howling down from the Arctic. The name suggests a place so far north that even the god of winter couldn't reach it. A polar paradise in regions that should have been frozen waste. This wasn't obscure knowledge tucked away in forgotten texts. Ancient Greek philosophers discussed Hyperborea openly. Roman scholars documented it. Persian priests referenced it in sacred writings. Indian sages described it in Sanskrit verses. These weren't random fantasies scattered across disconnected cultures. These were coordinated traditions appearing in civilizations separated by thousands of miles, supposedly with limited contact. The descriptions share uncanny similarities. A land in the far north where the sun circled the horizon for 6 months without setting, then disappeared for 6 months into darkness. Where people lived for 1,000 years without aging, without disease, without war. Where golden temples reflected perpetual twilight during the long summer day. Where art, music, and wisdom flourished in ways that made even the Greeks, who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization, speak with reverence. Imagine standing in ancient Athens on a warm evening, listening to philosophers describe this place. They didn't frame it as fairy tale. They spoke of Hyperborea with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for Egypt or Persia. They debated its exact location. They discussed the routes by which Hyperboreans supposedly sent sacred offerings south to Delos. They described architectural details, cultural practices, religious customs. Why would they do this? Why would multiple ancient cultures, spanning Greek, Roman, Persian, and Indian traditions, describe remarkably similar northern paradises with such specific, consistent details? The conventional answer dismisses these accounts as mythology, pure imagination. The ancients, we're told, simply made up stories about lands they'd never seen. But this explanation contains uncomfortable assumptions. It assumes ancient peoples couldn't distinguish between fantasy and geography. It assumes multiple cultures independently invented nearly identical myths by pure coincidence. It assumes that specificity, the 6-month day, the architectural details, the migration routes meant nothing. But what if these weren't myths? What if they were memories? Not perfect memories, certainly. Stories passed down across generations become distorted, embellished, transformed. Details shift. Timelines compress. The mundane becomes magical through retelling, but the core, the kernel of actual experience might remain. Consider what that would mean. It would mean that at some point in the deep past, peoples in far northern regions developed sophisticated cultures, that they built, created, flourished in places we now consider uninhabitable. That when climate changed and forced them south, they brought stories that seemed impossible to those who only knew the north as frozen darkness. That these stories, transmitted across countless generations, survived as myths about paradise beyond the north wind. The ancient world had names for this place in different languages. The Greeks called it Hyperborea, the Persians called it Erianum Veejo, the Indians referenced Uttarakuru. Different names, different cultures, different languages. But the descriptions aligned. A northern homeland, a place of perfection now lost, a memory of something that was. This raises a question that echoes across 3,000 years. When ancient peoples described Hyperborea with the same confidence they described real places, when they provided specific details rather than vague fantasies, when multiple cultures told the same story independently, were they remembering something real? The name has whispered across millennia. Perhaps it's time to listen to what it's saying. Pliny the Elder, the Roman scholar who documented everything from eclipses to elephants, described Hyperborea not in his sections on mythology, but in his chapters on actual geography. He placed it as confidently as he placed Britain or Egypt. Understanding what ancient writers actually said about Hyperborea requires looking at the texts themselves, not later interpretations. The sources are specific, detailed, and often surprisingly matter-of-fact. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BCE, approached Hyperborea with his characteristic skepticism. He noted that he personally doubted the more extravagant claims, but he documented what others reported, that Hyperboreans lived in perfect harmony beyond the land of the Scythians, that they worshipped Apollo in magnificent temples, that they sent sacred offerings wrapped in wheat straw to Delos through a chain of peoples, each passing the offerings to the next until they reached Greece. Herodotus was careful to distinguish what he believed from what he reported. His skepticism about Hyperborea wasn't about whether people claimed it existed, they clearly did, but about the more miraculous elements of those claims. Pliny the Elder, writing his natural history in the 1st century CE, took a different approach. He described Hyperborea as a real geographic location with specific features: 6 months of continuous daylight when the sun never set, 6 months of darkness when it never rose, fertile lands despite the northern latitude, people living for extraordinary lengths without disease. Pliny documented these claims in the same encyclopedic manner. He documented everything else as facts to be recorded, whether or not they seemed incredible. The Greek poet Pindar, in his odes, celebrated Hyperborean perfection. He described it as a land blessed by Apollo, where people lived free from toil and war, where music and poetry flourished, where the very air carried enchantment. But Pindar was a poet, and poets embellish. More revealing are the prose accounts. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian from the 1st century BCE, provided extensive details about Hyperborea. He described its culture, religious practices, and supposed connections to Greek civilization. He claimed that Apollo himself visited Hyperborea regularly, that the Hyperboreans maintained ancient links to the Greek world, that their wisdom influenced Greek philosophy and religion. Here's what's striking. These writers distinguished between mythology and geography in other contexts. Herodotus clearly marked when he was relating myths versus what he considered factual accounts. Pliny organized his work systematically, separating mythological creatures from actual animals, legendary places from real geography. Yet when they discussed Hyperborea, many placed it in the category of geography, not divine mythology. The Persian Avesta sacred Zoroastrian texts describes Arianem Vaejo, the original homeland in the north where the first humans lived in paradise. Then Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit, sent winter, 10 months of winter, 2 months of summer. The land became uninhabitable. The people were forced to migrate south. The descriptions match climate catastrophe, not divine punishment, freezing temperatures, failed harvests, forced displacement. Sanskrit texts reference Uttarakuru, the northern land of perfection where the righteous dwelled. Mount Meru, the axis of the world, stood in the north. The sun, moon, and stars circled it. The descriptions suggest polar geography, celestial bodies circling the horizon, extended daylight and darkness, a world centered on the pole. The consistency across cultures is remarkable. Not vague, paradise in the north, but specific details. The unusual solar patterns, the cold, sudden arrival, the forced migration, the preserved memory of a better time before the freeze. Ancient writers were capable of critical thinking. They distinguished reliable from unreliable sources. They debated geographic claims. They corrected each other's errors. Why assume they completely abandoned these faculties only when discussing northern lands? Why assume Beyond the North Wind was pure fantasy when they treated it with the same seriousness they treated other distant places? The texts exist. The descriptions are detailed. The question is whether we're willing to consider what they might actually be describing. Australian Aboriginals preserve accurate oral histories spanning 10,000 years. Greek civilization is only 3,000 years old. If myths about Hyperborea preserve memories from the last warm period, the Greeks would be remembering something 5 times older than their own culture. The academic concept is called mythological memory, the idea that myths and legends can preserve actual historical events across vast timescales, transformed through countless retellings but retaining kernels of truth. This isn't speculation. This is documented phenomenon. Heinrich Schliemann discovered Troy in 1870 by taking Homer seriously. Scholars had dismissed the Iliad as pure fiction. Schliemann followed the geographic descriptions and found the actual city, exactly where Homer said it would be. The story had been transmitted for 3,000 years, accumulating embellishments and divine interventions. But the core, the city, the war, the location was real. Arthur Evans found Minoan Crete by following myths about King Minos and the labyrinth. The palace at Knossos, with its complex layout, matched the legendary descriptions. The myth preserved the memory of an actual Bronze Age civilization. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis proposes that Mediterranean flooding into the Black Sea basin around 5,600 BCE created the flood myths appearing across Middle Eastern cultures. One catastrophic event, preserved in multiple traditions, transformed through retelling, but remembering the core truth. The waters rose. The world as people knew it drowned. Aboriginal Australian songlines encode landscape features and events from over 10,000 years ago. Geologists confirm that coastal descriptions in oral traditions match coastlines as they existed when sea levels were lower, before the end of the last ice age. The stories preserved accurate geographic information across 400 generations. If oral tradition can preserve truth for 10,000 years, what about Hyperborean myths? Greek civilization emerged around 1000 BCE, but the myths they inherited might be far older, passed down from previous cultures, embedded with memories from times when Greece itself didn't exist. Scholars like Felice Vinci have explored whether Greek myths encode memories of northern geography. The descriptions in Homer, the extended twilight, the unusual stellar patterns, the amber trade, the navigation techniques sometimes seem to reference Baltic and Arctic regions rather than Mediterranean ones, as if the stories originated in the north and were later transplanted to Greek settings. Consider the climate history. During the Younger Dryas period, 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, Earth experienced rapid climate fluctuations. Before and after this cold spell, there were periods when Arctic regions were significantly warmer than now. The Holocene thermal maximum, roughly 9,000 to 5,000 years ago, saw temperatures several degrees higher than present. Northern regions, currently frozen, were temperate. The Arctic ice was diminished. Coastlines were different. If human populations inhabited these regions during warm periods, developed cultures, built settlements, then faced catastrophic climate change as cold returned, wouldn't they remember? Wouldn't the story of Paradise Lost, the homeland becoming uninhabitable, the forced migration south, wouldn't that be exactly the kind of traumatic event that gets preserved in oral tradition? We're discovering that sophisticated cultures existed far earlier than conventional timelines suggested. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dates to 11,600 years ago. Massive stone structures requiring organization and astronomical knowledge, built when humans were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers. Poverty Point in Louisiana, elaborate earthworks from 3,700 years ago. Complex astronomical alignments in megalithic structures across Europe, encoding knowledge that supposedly didn't exist. The pattern suggests we've underestimated ancient peoples' sophistication and reach. If complex cultures existed earlier and more widely than believed, if climate once made polar regions habitable, if oral tradition preserves memories across 10,000 years, then Hyperborean myths might be doing exactly what Aboriginal songlines do, remembering actual places and events from a past so distant it seems mythical. The Greeks might have been remembering something real, something so old that only the outline remained, but real nonetheless. Ice core samples from Greenland show that 8,000 years ago, the Arctic was warm enough to support forests. The pyramids of Egypt are only 4,500 years old. That means forests grew in Greenland more recently than we built our most ancient monuments. The Arctic hasn't always been frozen. This isn't speculation. This is documented scientific fact, written in ice cores, sediment layers, and fossilized remains. During the Eemian interglacial period, roughly 130,000 to 115,000 years ago, Arctic temperatures were 5 to 8 degrees Celsius warmer than today. Forests covered Greenland. Hippopotamus wallowed in the Thames River, in what's now England. The polar ice caps were dramatically reduced. The Arctic Ocean was largely ice-free during summer months. Scientists know this with precision. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica contain air bubbles, tiny atmospheric samples from the past, preserved in frozen time. Chemical analysis reveals past temperatures, greenhouse gas concentrations, and volcanic activity spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Sediment cores from the ocean floor show pollen types, indicating what plants grew where and when. Tree ring data extends climate records back millennia. Fossilized plant remains in Arctic regions tell what once lived in places now barren. The evidence is overwhelming. The poles cycle between frozen and temperate over vast timescales. More recently, and more relevant to human civilization, came the Holocene climate optimum, roughly 9,000 to 5,000 years ago. Arctic temperatures were 2 to 3 degrees warmer than present. This might not sound dramatic, but the effects were profound. Tree lines extended hundreds of miles further north than today. Boreal forests grew where tundra now dominates. Sea ice was minimal during summer months. Greenland's ice sheet was smaller. Arctic coastlines and geography were dramatically different. What is now frozen wasteland was habitable land. What is now permanent ice was open water. What is now barren was forest. The mechanism driving these cycles is understood. Milankovitch cycles, predictable variations in Earth's orbit, and axial tilt change how much solar radiation reaches different parts of the planet over 20,000 to 40,000 year periods. When orbital parameters align properly, polar regions receive significantly more summer sunlight, ice melts, temperatures rise. The feedback effects compound. Less ice means less reflection of sunlight, which means more warming, which means even less ice. These warm periods weren't universal or uniform. They affected different regions at different intensities and different times. But for extended periods measured in thousands of years, northern polar regions were dramatically more hospitable than they are today. Consider what this means. During the Holocene climate optimum, when Egypt was developing hieroglyphs and Mesopotamia was building cities, the Arctic was warmer than now. When Stonehenge was being constructed, Greenland had forests. When the first Chinese dynasties were emerging, northern Siberia was temperate. Archaeological evidence confirms humans reached the Arctic far earlier than once believed. The Yana rhinoceros horn site in Siberia dates to 32,000 years ago, people living and thriving in extreme northern latitudes during the last ice age. They developed sophisticated ivory working, created art, employed survival strategies, showing deep understanding of their environment. By 45,000 years ago, humans had reached regions within the Arctic Circle. If people could survive in the Arctic during ice age conditions, what could they accomplish during warm periods? During the climate optimum, northern regions might have been more attractive for settlement than southern areas. Moderate temperatures, abundant resources from both land and sea, rich fisheries, navigable waterways, long summer days providing extended working hours, less disease pressure than tropical regions. Different challenges than the south, certainly, but potentially advantageous ones. The fossil record shows what thrived during warm periods. Temperate zone plants in Arctic latitudes. Forest ecosystems supporting diverse wildlife. Marine resources in abundance. Coastal environments perfect for human settlement. Then the climate shifted. Temperatures dropped, ice advanced, tree lines retreated. The habitable north became inhospitable. Whatever existed there was buried, drowned, or destroyed. The cycle is written in ice. The Arctic has been warm before. It will be warm again. The question isn't whether it was possible for humans to thrive there during warm periods. The question is, did they? And if they did, what remains of what they built? The ice remembers. Slowly, reluctantly, it's beginning to tell us. In 2016, melting ice in Norway revealed a 3,000-year-old arrow, perfectly preserved. In 2019, a complete Viking tunic emerged from a glacier. Every year, the ice gives back things we didn't know were hidden. The question isn't whether there's evidence under the ice, it's what happens when the ice finally melts. The obvious objection to any theory about ancient Arctic civilizations is simple. Where's the evidence? If sophisticated cultures existed in polar regions thousands of years ago, why haven't we found their cities, their tools, their remains? The answer lies in understanding what happens to evidence in the Arctic. Glacial advance and retreat is one of the most destructive forces imaginable. When ice kilometers thick spreads across a landscape, it grinds everything beneath it to powder. Rock is crushed, soil is scraped away down to bedrock. Anything on the surface is pulverized and scattered. When glaciers retreat, they leave behind landscapes, scrubbed clean of most evidence of what existed before. But destruction by ice is only the beginning. Since the last glacial maximum roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels have risen over 120 meters. Coastal areas where human settlements would most likely have existed near harbors, fisheries, and trade routes are now deep underwater. Doggerland, the landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe, hosted sophisticated Mesolithic cultures for thousands of years. Then rising seas drowned it completely. An entire region the size of the Netherlands, with all its inhabitants and settlements, vanished beneath the North Sea. We only know Doggerland existed because of seafloor surveys and artifacts occasionally dredged up by fishing boats. If an Arctic civilization existed along coasts during the Holocene climate optimum, those coasts are now underwater. The settlements, ports, and cities would be beneath meters of sediment in Arctic seas that are ice-covered most of the year and extraordinarily difficult to survey. Permafrost creates its own challenges. annual freeze-thaw cycles, operating over thousands of years, break apart anything not buried deeply enough. The ground literally churns, bringing deeper material to the surface, while grinding surface material to fragments. Organic materials, wood, leather, cloth, even bone decompose rapidly during brief summer thaws. Then, there's the sheer vastness and inaccessibility of Arctic regions. Most of the Arctic has never been systematically surveyed for archaeological remains. The regions are remote, dangerous, accessible only during brief summer seasons, and expensive to operate in. Archaeological funding and research effort concentrate on Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and tropical regions, where preservation is better, access easier, and the return on investment higher. Yet despite these obstacles, discoveries keep emerging. The 5,300-year-old Ötzi was found in melting alpine ice, perfectly preserved, revealing details about Copper Age life that no other evidence could provide. Viking settlements are emerging from retreating Greenland glaciers, showing how Norse colonies once thrived in regions now too cold for permanent habitation. Norwegian ice patches, melting due to warming temperatures, reveal hunting camps and artifacts dating back 6,000 years sites that were preserved in ice and are only now becoming visible again. Recent discoveries push human Arctic occupation back further than previously believed. The Yana rhinoceros horn site in Siberia dates to 32,000 years ago and shows sophisticated ivory working, organized hunting, and long-term occupation. The Berelek site reveals organized mammoth hunting 13,000 years ago, with evidence of surprising cultural sophistication. These discoveries share something crucial. They were found by accident or only because ice melted enough to expose them. They suggest that Arctic ice and seas might contain far more than we've found because we haven't looked, can't look, or haven't waited long enough for the ice to reveal what it holds. Consider a thought experiment. A civilization exists in the Arctic 10,000 years ago during the climate optimum. They build with wood, like most northern peoples. They settle along coasts for fishing and trade. Then climate shifts, glaciers advance. Their coastal cities are drowned by rising seas. Their inland settlements are ground to dust by advancing ice. Organic materials decompose. After 10,000 years of ice grinding, sea level rise, and permafrost churning, what survives? Almost nothing. Perhaps a few stone tools in protected locations. Maybe some durable artifacts deep enough to avoid destruction. But cities, architecture, the evidence of daily life? Gone. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Especially in an environment designed to erase evidence. The ice is melting faster now than it has in thousands of years. Each summer exposes more. Each year reveals artifacts we didn't know existed. What else is waiting beneath the ice? The Piri-Reis map from 1513 shows coastline details of Antarctica that shouldn't have been known until the 1950 seconds, when ground-penetrating radar revealed what lay beneath the ice. The mapmaker claimed he copied it from older sources. How much older? Despite the archaeological challenges, anomalies exist. Findings that resist easy explanation. Structures, artifacts, and records suggesting more complex northern human history than conventional narratives acknowledge. The Kola Peninsula in northern Russia contains massive stone structures, precisely cut blocks, carefully arranged, of uncertain age and purpose. The Seda Zero area features pyramid-shaped mountains that some researchers argue show signs of artificial modification. Though this remains intensely controversial, mainstream archaeology dismisses these claims, attributing the formations to natural geological processes. But the precision of certain cuts and arrangements continues to provoke debate. The White Sea petroglyphs in northern Russia date to 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. They show sophisticated astronomical knowledge, tracking stellar and solar cycles with precision. They depict navigation techniques and seafaring that seem advanced for the supposed technological level of the region during that period. Who created them? What knowledge systems were they part of? Then there are the maps. The Piri-Reis map of 1513 allegedly shows Antarctica's coastline beneath the ice. The Turkish admiral who created it claimed he compiled information from multiple older maps, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. Critics argue the supposed Antarctic coastline is actually a distorted South American coast. Proponents point to details that seem too accurate for coincidence. The Orontius Phineus map from 1531 purportedly shows Antarctica's interior features, mountains, rivers, coastlines, as they would appear without ice. Mainstream cartographic history explains these as errors, misinterpretations, or artistic flourishes. Yet the questions persist. Why do multiple maps from the 16th century show Antarctic coastlines? Where did the source material come from? Charles Hapgood's Earth-shifting crust hypothesis proposed that polar regions were once in different latitudes due to crustal displacement, which would explain maps showing ice-free polar coastlines. The hypothesis is largely rejected by geology and geophysics, but it represents one attempt to explain these cartographic mysteries. Historical precedent exists for the rise and fall of northern cultures due to climate change. Norse settlements in Greenland thrived during the medieval warm period from roughly 950 to 1250 CE. They built churches, farms, and trading posts. They survived for centuries. Then temperatures dropped during the Little Ice Age. The settlements were abandoned. When Europeans returned centuries later, they found ruins. The Norse Greenlanders had vanished. This demonstrates concretely what theories about earlier Arctic civilizations propose: that cultures can flourish in northern regions during warm periods, then collapse or migrate when climate deteriorates. It's not speculation. It's documented history. Siberian archaeology reveals sophistication that challenges narratives about primitive northern peoples. Elaborate burial mounds contain artifacts showing long-distance trade connections. Mediterranean goods in Siberian graves, Arctic products in southern sites. Evidence of metallurgy, craftsmanship, and social organization rivaling contemporary civilizations further south. These weren't isolated hunter-gatherers but organized societies with developed cultures. None of these anomalies proves Hyperborea. Taken individually, each has alternative explanations. The pyramid-shaped mountains might be natural, the maps might be errors, the sophistication of northern cultures might fit within conventional timelines. But taken together, they suggest something worth considering: that human activity in northern regions has been more extensive, more sophisticated, and reaches back further than standard archaeological narratives acknowledge. That the Arctic hasn't always been the frozen periphery, but was, during warm periods, a center of human activity and possibly innovation. The anomalies persist, the questions remain, and every year, melting ice reveals more artifacts we didn't expect, from periods we didn't anticipate, in conditions we assumed precluded human presence. The ice is still giving up its secrets. Perhaps the most significant revelations are yet to come. Ancient Sanskrit texts describe a polar homeland where the sun stayed above the horizon for months. Greek texts describe the same thing and call it Hyperborea. These cultures were separated by 3,000 miles and supposedly had minimal contact. How did they both remember the same impossible place? The Rig Veda, composed roughly 3,500 years ago but preserving much older oral traditions, contains passages that have puzzled scholars for centuries. Descriptions of the original Aryan homeland, the place where the Vedic peoples lived before migrating into India. The geographical details seem impossible for the Indian subcontinent. The texts describe a land where the sun circled the horizon for extended periods without setting, where the year divided into long stretches of continuous light and continuous darkness, where dawn lasted for days, not the brief tropical sunrise of India, but extended twilight stretching across what we would call weeks, where specific stars were visible at positions only possible from high northern latitudes. In 1903, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, an Indian scholar and freedom fighter, published The Arctic Home in the Vedas. His analysis was rigorous and unsettling. Examining Vedic astronomical references systematically, he argued that the hymns preserved memories of Arctic residents. The descriptions of dawn lasting 30 days, the year divided into one long day and one long night, the celestial observations impossible from India but consistent with polar regions. Tilak wasn't a fringe theorist proposing wild speculation. He was a respected scholar working from Sanskrit texts, using astronomical data and careful textual analysis. His conclusions challenged conventional thinking, but his methodology was sound. The Vedas describe Meru, the cosmic mountain located at the North Pole in Hindu cosmology. Around Meru, the stars and sun rotate. The descriptions match what would be observed from a polar perspective: celestial bodies circling the horizon rather than rising and setting. From the equator, stars rise in the east and set in the west. From the pole, they circle horizontally around a fixed point. The Vedic descriptions match polar observation. The Avesta, The sacred texts of Zoroastrianism from ancient Persia tells a parallel story. Mveho, the original homeland of humanity, located in the north, a perfect land, the first place created by Ahura Mazda, where life flourished in harmony. Then, Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, attacked. He sent brutal winter. 10 months of winter, 2 months of summer. The land became uninhabitable. The people were forced to migrate south, spreading across the world, carrying memories of their lost paradise. The Avesta frames this as myth, but the description is remarkably specific. Not divine punishment, but environmental catastrophe. Climate change making a homeland uninhabitable. Forced migration. The pattern matches exactly what would happen if populations living in Arctic regions during the Holocene climate optimum were displaced by returning cold as the warm period ended. These weren't considered mythological accounts by their cultures. They were preserved as history, ancestral memories, the story of origins and migration, the explanation of where people came from and why. The scholarly debate about Indo-European origins typically centers on the Kurgan hypothesis origins in the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black Sea, but alternative theories propose more northern origins, and the linguistic evidence is intriguing. Indo-European vocabulary includes extensive terminology for cold climate flora and fauna, words for wolves, bears, snow, ice, pine forests. The reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language contains these terms as fundamental vocabulary, not later borrowings. This suggests the original speakers lived in cold regions, not tropical or temperate ones. Genetic studies show Indo-European populations carry adaptations to cold climate, variations associated with surviving high UV exposure from sun reflecting off snow and ice. Metabolic adaptations to cold. These aren't recent developments but ancient genetic signatures, suggesting northern origins for Indo-European peoples. The convergence is striking. Greek myths describing Hyperborea, Persian texts describing Mvejo, Sanskrit texts describing the Arctic homeland, all Indo-European cultures, all describing northern origins, all preserving memories of polar or near-polar residents, all describing forced migration due to climate change. Two explanations exist. Either these cultures engaged in extensive cultural transmission, sharing and synchronizing their origin myths, despite vast distances and supposedly limited contact, or these are independent memories of the same historical reality. Indo-European populations once living in far northern regions, displaced by climate change, migrating south and bringing stories of their lost homeland. The texts exist. The astronomical references are real. The consistency across cultures is documented. The question is, how to interpret it? The Greeks remembered Hyperborea. The Persians remembered Mvejo. The Indians remembered the Arctic homeland. Different names for the same memory. Different languages describing the same lost place. A northern paradise that became northern wasteland, forcing those who lived there to seek new homes, carrying stories that seemed impossible to peoples who only knew the north as frozen darkness. The memory persists across 3,000 years and 3,000 miles. Perhaps it persists because something real once existed to remember. The Inuit have oral traditions about people who lived in the Arctic before them, the Tunit. In 1925, archaeologists discovered evidence of an earlier Arctic culture that vanished mysteriously. The Inuit had been right all along. What else might they be right about? The pattern of northern homeland myths extends beyond Indo-European cultures. Chinese mythology describes Kunlun Mountain, located in the extreme west and north, the axis mundi, where earth and heaven meet, the dwelling place of the queen, mother of the west. Surrounded by perfect lands where immortals live beyond the reach of death and time, the classic of mountains and seas, compiled over 2,000 years ago but containing much older material, describes fantastic northern and western lands in elaborate detail, unusual animals, sophisticated cultures, geographical features that seem impossible. Mainstream scholarship dismisses these descriptions as pure fantasy, the imaginative elaboration of storytellers encountering reports of distant lands. But some researchers suggest these texts might encode actual geographical knowledge of Central Asian and northern regions, distorted through cultural translation and millennia of oral transmission. Place names that seem mythical might reference real locations. Fantastic animals might be unfamiliar species described by people lacking the vocabulary to name them precisely. Impossible geography might reflect landscapes that existed during different climate periods. The Chinese texts, like their Indo-European counterparts, place significant emphasis on northern and western regions as sources of knowledge, immortality, and perfection. The pattern repeats across cultures. The far north as paradise, as homeland, as place of wisdom. Then there are the indigenous Arctic peoples themselves, the Inuit, Sami, Nenets, Chukchi, Aleut, and dozens of other groups who have inhabited polar and subarctic regions for thousands of years. Their oral traditions are specific, detailed, and carefully distinguished from mythology. Inuit traditions describe the Tuniat, the Dorset culture who inhabited the Arctic before the Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, arrived. The stories describe the Tuniat as immensely strong, able to move massive stones that modern people couldn't lift. Skilled hunters but lacking certain technologies the Thule possessed. Different in appearance, in customs, in capabilities. When archaeologists began systematic Arctic surveys in the early 20th century, they discovered the Dorset culture exactly where Inuit tradition said previous peoples had lived. The archaeological evidence matched oral traditions with uncanny accuracy. The Dorset existed from roughly 500 BCE to 1500 CE, then vanished mysteriously around the time the Thule arrived. The Inuit had preserved accurate historical memory for 500 years, distinguishing it clearly from mythology. This validation of indigenous oral history raises a crucial question. What else in their traditions might be historically accurate? Sami traditions in northern Scandinavia describe ancient peoples who lived there before the Sami, who built the Sida's sacred stone structures and possessed knowledge of the land that was old when the Sami arrived. Some traditions describe times when the lands were warmer, when different plants grew, when the sea was different. Indigenous Arctic peoples developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, complex understanding of celestial mechanics, precise tracking of seasonal patterns, navigation techniques that allowed travel across vast distances in environments where visible landmarks are rare or non-existent. This wasn't primitive superstition, but systematic observation and knowledge transmission across generations. The sophistication rivaled or exceeded classical Mediterranean civilization's astronomical achievements. Yet because Arctic peoples didn't write their knowledge in forms Europeans recognized as scientific, it was dismissed as folklore. Indigenous place memory, oral traditions about landscape changes, sea level variations, climate shifts, has been repeatedly validated by modern geology and archaeology. Stories about islands that no longer exist match bathymetric surveys of now submerged lands. Accounts of coastline changes match geological evidence of sea level rise. Descriptions of different climate conditions match paleoclimate data. These aren't vague myths, but precise historical accounts, transmitted with remarkable accuracy across time periods that exceed written European history. Many indigenous traditions describe times when their lands were warmer, when animals lived there that no longer do, when peoples who came before possessed different technologies or knowledge, when certain areas now barren once supported different ecosystems. These traditions are typically framed as history, not mythology. The distinction matters. Indigenous peoples distinguish between sacred stories explaining cosmology and historical accounts of actual events. When they describe previous inhabitants or warmer periods, they frame it as historical memory, not divine revelation. The convergence of traditions is striking. Indo-European cultures remembering northern homelands, Chinese texts emphasizing northern and western paradises, indigenous Arctic peoples preserving memories of different climate conditions and previous inhabitants. Either all these cultures independently invented similar myths through pure coincidence, or they're preserving distorted but real memories of historical conditions. Warmer Arctic periods, displaced populations, climate catastrophes that forced migration and cultural transformation. The Inuit were right about the Tuniat. What else might they be right about? What other aspects of indigenous Arctic oral tradition might preserve accurate historical memory waiting for validation? The traditions persist across cultures, continents, and millennia. Perhaps they persist because something real happened, something worth remembering. Pythagoras, the mathematician who revolutionized Greek thought, supposedly learned from Hyperborean teachers. Ancient Greeks who considered themselves the height of civilization claimed their wisdom came from people living beyond the frozen north. Why would they credit barbarians with teaching them? Greek accounts of Hyperborea don't describe primitive survival in harsh conditions. They describe the most blessed of peoples, free from disease, war, and toil, living for 1,000 years, devoted to music, art, philosophy, and worship of Apollo. These descriptions sound like idealized fantasy, but analyzed carefully, they suggest something specific: a culture with sufficient resources that intensive labor wasn't required. This implies either exceptionally productive environment or efficient technology, possibly both. Social organization sophisticated enough to avoid warfare. Medical knowledge or environmental conditions promoting exceptional health and longevity. Not magic, but advantages that would seem miraculous to peoples lacking them. Ancient sources credited Hyperboreans with advanced astronomical knowledge. They understood celestial mechanics with precision, could predict astronomical events, tracked stellar and solar cycles with accuracy exceeding Greek capabilities. This isn't vague mysticism but specific technical expertise. Descriptions of Hyperborean architecture mention magnificent temples, cities planned with geometric precision, structures defying the engineering capabilities Greeks attributed to other contemporary cultures, golden temples reflecting perpetual twilight during the long polar day, architecture adapted to extreme seasonal variations in light. Multiple Greek sources claim that philosophy, certain musical forms, and religious practices originated in Hyperborea and were brought south by migrants or traders. The Greeks, confident in their own cultural superiority, nevertheless acknowledged debts to northern wisdom. The figure of Abaris appears repeatedly in ancient accounts. A Hyperborean priest who visited Greece, demonstrated abilities that seemed miraculous, possessed profound wisdom, carried a golden arrow that never missed, or in some versions, flew on an arrow across vast distances. The accounts sound mythological, but they might encode real visits by northern peoples, possessing advanced knowledge that Greeks couldn't explain. Pythagoras supposedly studied with Hyperborean teachers. His mathematical and philosophical innovations derived from northern traditions, according to some ancient sources. Whether literally true or not, the claim reveals Greek willingness to credit northern peoples with wisdom exceeding their own. References to Hyperborean sun temples suggest sophisticated astronomical observation, structures aligned to solar cycles, tracking solstices, equinoxes, stellar positions with precision. The kind of astronomical knowledge that requires generations of systematic observation and mathematical framework to interpret the data. Descriptions of Hyperborean music mention its seemingly magical properties, creating harmony, healing disease, inducing specific mental states. These claims sound supernatural, but they might encode advanced understanding of acoustic properties, resonance, and sound's physiological effects, knowledge that would appear magical to peoples without theoretical framework to understand it. The pattern across sources is consistent. Hyperboreans aren't described as primitive survivors, but as possessors of wisdom exceeding Mediterranean civilizations. As teachers, not students. As the source of knowledge, not recipients. This reverses expected narratives about cultural development. Conventional thinking assumes civilization advances from warm, resource-rich regions toward harsher environments. That sophisticated culture emerges in fertile river valleys, not frozen tundra. That peoples in extreme climates survive rather than thrive, endure rather than excel. But ancient sources consistently describe the opposite regarding Hyperborea. Northern peoples possessing superior knowledge, Arctic regions as sources of wisdom, the far north as place of advancement, not primitive struggle. If this seems implausible, consider what it might encode. If actual advanced civilization existed in Arctic regions during the Holocene climate optimum, when those regions were temperate and resource-rich and was forced south by returning cold, what would the aftermath look like? Displaced peoples bringing sophisticated knowledge to less advanced southern populations. Stories of wise teachers from the far north. Tales of a lost homeland where knowledge and culture flourished. Southern peoples unable to verify these claims because the north had become frozen wasteland, but preserving the stories because the knowledge proved valuable. This pattern would create exactly the mythology we find. Hyperborea as paradise, northern peoples as possessors of ancient wisdom, knowledge flowing from north to south rather than the reverse. The Greeks considered themselves civilized, and northern peoples barbaric, yet they credited those same northern peoples with teaching them wisdom. They described Hyperborean culture as superior to their own. They presented themselves as students of northern knowledge. Why would they do this, unless they believed it was true? Unless their oldest traditions preserved memories of knowledge actually flowing from north to south, from Hyperborean teachers to Greek students, from a time when the roles were reversed and civilization flourished in the far north. The pattern persists across sources. perhaps because it preserves something real. The Zoroastrian texts describe the catastrophe that destroyed the northern paradise. Sudden cold, 10 months of winter, forcing everyone to flee south. In 12,800 BCE, geological evidence shows the Earth plunged into a mini ice age in less than a decade. The myths weren't wrong about what happened, just about when. The Avesta describes Aryan Mvejo with specific, loving detail. The first place created by Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity, perfect in every way, beautiful rivers, abundant life, harmonious people living without conflict or want. The homeland, the beginning, the paradise. Then Angra Mainyu attacked. The destructive spirit, the force of chaos and entropy, struck at the perfect land. He sent winter, not gradual climate change, not slowly cooling temperatures. Catastrophic, sudden, brutal winter. 10 months of freezing cold. Only 2 months when warmth returned. The land couldn't support life under these conditions. Plants died, animals fled or perished. The people had no choice but to abandon their homeland and migrate south, carrying only memories of what they'd lost. The specificity matters. This isn't vague divine punishment. It's environmental catastrophe described with remarkable precision. The sudden onset, the overwhelming cold, the forced displacement. Norse mythology tells of Fimbulwinter. 3 consecutive winters without summer in between. The sun loses its warmth. Snow falls from all directions. The world freezes. Fimbulwinter precedes Ragnarok, the end of the world, and its subsequent renewal. But what if Fimbulwinter wasn't prophecy but memory? What if it preserved the cultural memory of actual catastrophic winters that ended a world? Around 12,800 years ago, something happened. The Earth had been warming steadily from the last ice age. Ice sheets were retreating, sea levels rising, temperatures increasing, populations expanding into newly habitable territories. Then, suddenly, the warming reversed. The Younger Dryas. A period of dramatic cooling lasting over 1,000 years. Temperatures plunged back toward glacial conditions in less than a decade, perhaps in as little as 3 years according to some ice core data. It wasn't gradual. It was catastrophic. The cause remains debated. One theory proposes massive meltwater pulse from glacial lakes, disrupting ocean currents, particularly the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation that brings warm water north. Without that warm current, northern regions froze. Another theory, controversial, but gaining evidence, suggests cosmic impact. A comet or asteroid fragment exploding over North America, triggering rapid cooling through impact winter effects. Volcanic activity might have contributed, or internal climate system feedbacks created sudden shift. Whatever the cause, the effects were devastating. Advancing glaciers, plummeting temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, ecosystems collapsing, species going extinct. The human cost would have been catastrophic. Populations that had adapted to warming conditions suddenly faced returning ice. Coastal settlements drowned as sea levels shifted. Inland areas overrun by advancing ice sheets. Food sources disappearing. Survival requiring migration or death. If any civilization had developed in Arctic or subarctic regions during the pre-Younger Dryas warming, taking advantage of temperate conditions, rich resources, long summer days, the catastrophic return to glacial conditions would have been civilization ending. Everything they'd built would be destroyed, buried under ice, drowned by changing seas, ground to dust by advancing glaciers. The survivors would become refugees, forced south with only what they could carry, arriving in regions already inhabited by peoples adapted to those environments, bringing stories that would seem impossible, tales of a northern homeland where the sun circled the horizon, where great cities stood, where knowledge flourished, before the winter came and destroyed everything. These stories would persist, transformed through retelling across generations, the specific details blurring into mythology, the actual places becoming legendary, but the core memory surviving. There was a paradise in the north. It was destroyed by sudden catastrophic winter. The people were forced to flee. The Younger Dryas affected different regions differently. Some areas experienced catastrophic cooling. Others saw dramatic flooding as ice sheets melted unevenly. Still others faced drought as precipitation patterns shifted. This created a mosaic of disasters, different catastrophes in different places, but all part of the same global climate shift. This would generate diverse mythological accounts, different cultures experiencing different aspects of the same event, all preserving memories of catastrophe, but describing it through their particular experience and cultural lens. Flood myths, Ice Age legends, stories of lost paradises, not separate events but fragments of the same climate catastrophe, remembered differently. The geological evidence exists. The catastrophe happened. The only question is whether civilization existed in the regions it destroyed. Whether the myths preserving memories of Northern Paradise and its destruction are recording actual history. The winter came. That much is certain. What it destroyed remains to be discovered. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the world's oldest known temple, was built 11,500 years ago, right after the Younger Dryas ended. The people who built it were supposedly hunter-gatherers, yet they carved astronomical alignments into stone with precision that suggests centuries of observation and mathematical knowledge. Who taught them? Understanding what happens to knowledge during catastrophic displacement requires examining historical precedents. We have documented examples. We can see the patterns. The sea peoples during the Bronze Age collapse. Displaced populations migrating across the Mediterranean, carrying technologies, knowledge, cultural practices. They arrived in new regions simultaneously, as refugees and sometimes conquerors. Where they settled, they introduced new techniques, different cultural models, alternative knowledge systems. The disruption was catastrophic, but knowledge transfer occurred. The migration period following Rome's fall. Knowledge centers shifted dramatically. Classical learning persisted not in its original locations, but in unexpected places. Irish monasteries, Byzantine libraries, Islamic academies, refugee intellectuals, displaced craftspeople, monks fleeing violence, all carrying knowledge to new locations where it survived and sometimes flourished. More recent examples show consistent patterns. Refugee populations carry skilled craftspeople, intellectual traditions, cultural knowledge into their new homes. Sometimes this knowledge is lost within generations. Sometimes it transforms the receiving culture. Sometimes it persists in altered form. Certain types of knowledge survive displacement better than others. Practical knowledge, agriculture, metallurgy, navigation, construction survives because it remains immediately useful. Show someone how to work metal, and the technique persists. Astronomical knowledge transfers well through oral tradition and practical application. Calendar keeping and navigation require tracking celestial patterns. This knowledge stays functional and therefore survives. Medicinal knowledge travels if useful plants exist in new locations or if substitutes can be found. But contextual knowledge transforms. History becomes confused. Philosophy loses its framework. Religious systems that made sense in original contexts become mysterious in new settings. After several generations, the sophisticated understanding becomes garbled mythology. The original meaning is lost, but fragments persist. Imagine being part of the receiving population. Refugees arrive with knowledge your people don't possess. They can predict astronomical events with precision. They work materials in ways you've never seen. They possess architectural knowledge that seems impossible. They describe lands and conditions you've never encountered. How would you perceive them? As possessors of mysterious wisdom, as teachers of valuable techniques, possibly as divine or semi-divine figures if their knowledge seemed magical compared to your own capabilities. Archaeological evidence shows sudden advances in various regions following the Younger Dryas. The rapid development of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, sophisticated astronomical knowledge appearing in multiple locations, architectural innovations that seem fully developed rather than gradually evolving. Mainstream archaeology attributes these to independent invention or gradual development that isn't visible in the archaeological record. But consider alternative interpretation. Knowledge transfer from displaced northern populations arriving as refugees, bringing skills developed in their lost homeland. Göbekli Tepe stands as the prime example. Built immediately after the Younger Dryas by people who supposedly possessed no prior experience in monumental architecture or complex social organization. Yet the site shows sophisticated astronomical alignments, complex symbolic systems, engineering knowledge that shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines. Where did this knowledge come from? If it developed locally, why don't we see the gradual progression toward this sophistication? The site appears almost fully formed, as if the knowledge already existed and was applied rather than invented. The spread of megalithic architecture shows similar patterns. Multiple locations developing surprisingly similar techniques despite geographical separation. Astronomical alignments, precise stone cutting, massive construction projects requiring organizational sophistication. all appearing within relatively narrow timeframes following the Younger Dryas. Cultural founder effects explain how this could work. Small groups of knowledgeable refugees arrive in regions with less developed populations. Their influence on local culture becomes disproportionate to their numbers. Their technologies become adopted. Their beliefs become foundational to local traditions. Their stories become sacred histories. This would create exactly the global pattern we observe. Myths about wise visitors from the north, divine teachers bringing knowledge, gods gifting humanity with agriculture, astronomy, architecture, metallurgy. These stories appear worldwide with remarkable consistency. Perhaps they're not myths about gods but distorted memories of actual arrivals. Refugees from destroyed northern civilizations, carrying advanced knowledge to populations who received them as semi-divine teachers. The knowledge was real. The arrival was real. Only the interpretation that they were gods, rather than displaced humans, was mistaken. The pattern persists across cultures and continents. Wise visitors bringing knowledge, teachers from lost lands, divine gifts of civilization, different names, different details, but the same essential story. Perhaps because it happened, perhaps because the knowledge refugees were real. Modern Europeans carry genetic markers from a population called ancient North Eurasians, people who lived in Siberia 24,000 years ago. Their genes are also in Native Americans and Indians. A northern population contributed to peoples separated by thousands of miles. We found their DNA. We haven't found their cities. Population movements leave traces. In genetics, languages, cultural markers, recent advances reveal patterns invisible to traditional archaeology. Paleogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, has revolutionized understanding of human migrations. We can now extract and sequence DNA from bones thousands of years old. The stories genes tell often contradict what archaeology suggested. The ancestral North Eurasian component appears in surprising places. Modern Europeans, Native Americans, and Indian populations all carry genetic markers from this northern Siberian population. A people who lived in some of the harshest environments on Earth contributed significantly to diverse groups now separated by thousands of miles. This suggests major population movements from northern latitudes, multiple migrations in various directions, populations that originated in the far north spreading south and east and west, mixing with other populations, leaving genetic signatures that persist today. E-chromosome and mitochondrial DNA show expansion patterns from northern latitudes during post-glacial periods. Specific haplogroups, genetic lineages, originate in northern regions and spread outward as climate warmed and populations migrated. Ancient DNA from archaeological sites reveals complexity. Traditional archaeology missed. Population replacements that left minimal physical trace, but are visible genetically. Migrations invisible in material culture, but written in bones. Linguistic evidence provides another trail. Certain word roots appear across Indo-European languages, particularly terms relating to cold climate phenomena. Words for snow, ice, wolves, bears, northern trees. These aren't borrowings but fundamental vocabulary, suggesting the original speakers lived in northern regions. Grammatical structures shared across geographically separated language. Families hint at common origins or sustained contact. Place names in northern Europe preserve ancient roots predating known historical populations. Languages remember what archaeology can't always find. Cultural markers offer additional traces. Architectural styles appearing suddenly in archaeological records. No gradual development visible, just sophisticated techniques appearing fully formed. Artistic motifs showing northern imagery, sun symbols related to polar light cycles, specific animal representations appearing in unexpected southern contexts. Astronomical knowledge too advanced for supposed developmental stages of cultures. Megalithic sites aligned to celestial events with precision, suggesting centuries of observation and mathematical understanding. Where did this knowledge come from, if not inherited from more sophisticated predecessors? Recent findings suggest more complex post-glacial population movements than simple models accommodate, multiple migrations in various directions, population replacements leaving minimal archaeological trace, cultural continuities suggesting knowledge transfer across implausible distances. The spread of megalithic cultures across Atlantic Europe shows shared architectural principles despite supposed lack of contact. Similar techniques, comparable astronomical alignments, related symbolic systems appearing from Scandinavia to Malta to Britain to Spain. Independent invention or inherited knowledge system. Certain symbolic patterns, spirals, particular geometric forms appear in both Arctic rock art and Mediterranean sites with no obvious connection. Coincidence or evidence of cultural transmission? If we're looking for traces of displaced northern populations, we should examine genetic signatures showing northern ancestry in unexpected populations. Cultural elements in southern regions making more sense in Arctic contexts. Knowledge systems seeming more advanced than local development would suggest. Mythological traditions explicitly claiming northern origins. The genetic evidence is clear. Northern populations existed and contributed to diverse modern groups. Their DNA is found across continents, but their archaeological footprint is minimal. Their cities, if they existed, are hidden, buried under ice, drowned beneath seas, ground away by glaciers. We found their genes. We found hints in languages. We see cultural traces that might be their influence. But the physical evidence of their civilization, if it existed, remains elusive. This gap between genetic evidence and archaeological evidence suggests something profound. Populations existed and migrated and contributed to modern peoples, but their material culture is missing. Either it was never sophisticated enough to leave lasting traces, or it was destroyed so thoroughly that only fragments remain, waiting to be discovered beneath ice and sea. The displaced left traces in us, in our genes, our languages, our myths. Finding where they came from requires looking where no one has looked yet, under the ice, beneath the waves, in places we assume held nothing. There's something unsettling about standing at Stonehenge during the winter solstice. The sun rises precisely through the gap in the stones, illuminating the center with mathematical perfection. Thousands gather to witness it, but few ask the uncomfortable question. How did Neolithic farmers, supposedly struggling to survive, create something requiring centuries of systematic astronomical observation? These weren't people with telescopes or computers. They were, according to our history books, just learning to farm. Yet somehow they encoded celestial mechanics into stone with precision that rivals modern engineering. 5,200 years ago, someone built Newgrange in Ireland. Every winter solstice, light penetrates a narrow shaft and illuminates an inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. The alignment requires understanding not just where the sun rises today, but accounting for the slow shift in Earth's axial tilt over millennia. The engineering tolerances are impossibly tight. Water doesn't leak into the chamber after 5,000 years. The roof structure distributes weight so perfectly that nothing has shifted. We're asked to believe this was achieved by people who left no other evidence of such capabilities, no practice structures, no failed attempts, just sudden, perfect execution. Then there's the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from a Roman shipwreck, it's a bronze computational device with dozens of interlocking gears, capable of predicting eclipses, tracking planetary positions, and calculating the timing of Olympic Games decades in advance. The Greeks built this around 100 BCE. But here's what doesn't fit. Nothing else in their material culture suggests they possess this level of mechanical sophistication. It appears fully formed, as if someone handed them blueprints from a more advanced era. The Great Pyramid encodes mathematical relationships that shouldn't exist. Its height multiplied by 1 billion approximates the distance from Earth to the Sun. Its base perimeter divided by twice its height yields pi to several decimal places. The structure's orientation aligns with true north to within 3/60 of a single degree. Conventional explanations suggest coincidence or aesthetic preference, but the mathematics are too precise, too consistent. Either the builders understood principles that wouldn't be officially discovered for thousands of years, or they were working from inherited knowledge they didn't originate themselves. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, massive stone pillars carved by hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago align with specific stellar positions. But here's the anomaly. The alignments reference stellar positions from 2,000 years before the temple was built. The stars had shifted due to precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete a cycle. Recognizing precession requires observations spanning millennia. These supposedly primitive people were either using astronomical data they didn't collect themselves, or they'd been systematically observing the sky for far longer than conventional timelines allow. In Louisiana, Poverty Point rises from the swampland. Built 3,700 years ago, it consists of massive geometric earthworks aligned to solstice sunrises and sunsets. The precision requires advanced surveying techniques. The geometric complexity suggests mathematical knowledge that conventional archaeology doesn't attribute to North American cultures of that period. The same pattern repeats globally. Astronomical sophistication appearing where it shouldn't, executed with precision that seems impossible. The conventional explanation is gradual accumulation, generations of patient observers slowly building astronomical knowledge. But the problems multiply when you examine specifics. Some alignments require observation periods longer than the cultures existed. Some mathematical relationships appear fully formed, rather than evolving through trial and error. Some structures encode knowledge about Earth's dimensions that would require global exploration to verify. How did ancient cultures know the Earth's circumference with precision when they supposedly believed it was flat? There's another possibility. What if some ancient astronomical knowledge wasn't discovered by the cultures using it, but inherited from predecessors who conducted the original observations? If an advanced civilization existed during warm periods in polar regions, they would have compelling reasons for sophisticated astronomy. In the Arctic, navigating during extended twilight requires precise stellar knowledge. The dramatic seasonal changes would make solstice tracking critical for survival. The circumpolar stars, never setting, would form the foundation of their navigation systems, and precession, that slow cosmic wobble, would be more apparent to observers at high latitudes, tracking stars over long periods. Many ancient alignments reference northern celestial phenomena, or make most sense from perspectives further north than where the structures were built. The astronomical knowledge seems to have originated somewhere else, then migrated south. When warm periods ended and ice returned, the displaced populations would carry astronomical knowledge that would seem impossibly advanced to southern cultures who'd never needed such precision for survival. They wouldn't understand where it came from. They'd just know it worked. And they'd encode it into stone, preserving data from observations their ancestors made in a homeland they could barely remember, under skies that had shifted since those observations began. 65,000 years ago, humans crossed open ocean to reach Australia. This fact sits uncomfortably in our understanding of human history. It wasn't a short hop, at minimum 90 kilometers of open water during an ice age when sea levels were lower and land bridges exposed. They had no metal tools, no written language, no compasses, yet they successfully navigated waters we'd consider challenging with modern equipment. If Ice Age humans could accomplish this, what were they capable of during warm periods when northern passages opened and ice retreated from polar coasts? The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles across the Pacific, using only stars, wave patterns, and knowledge passed orally through generations. They could read swells created by distant islands below the horizon, identify latitude by zenith stars, and maintain course across weeks of open ocean. Western explorers meeting them assumed their navigation was crude guesswork until anthropologists documented the sophistication involved. These weren't primitive techniques stumbled upon accidentally. They represented systematic understanding of ocean dynamics, celestial mechanics, and environmental patterns refined over millennia. But there are navigation mysteries that make even Polynesian achievements seem insufficient for explaining what we find. The Piri Reis map, created in 1513, claims to be compiled from earlier sources. Some scholars examining it argue it shows Antarctic coastline with accuracy that shouldn't be possible, not just because Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, but because the coastline appears to show features currently buried under miles of ice. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these claims as misinterpretation or wishful thinking. But if the controversial features were accurate, it would require systematic exploration and mapping during ice-free periods, with knowledge transmission preserving navigational data across millennia. The Orontius Phineus map from 1531 allegedly depicts Antarctica decades before official discovery, showing geographical features matching what seismic surveys revealed under the ice in the 20th century. Chinese cartographic traditions suggest sophisticated understanding of global geography, predating European exploration. These aren't conspiracy theories, the maps exist. The question is what they actually show and where their information originated. Creating accurate maps requires exploration, systematic data collection, and techniques for translating spherical Earth onto flat surfaces. Someone had to go there and record what they found. Archaeological evidence suggests prehistoric Arctic exploration was more extensive than conventional timelines acknowledge. Inuit oral traditions describe precise mental maps of Arctic geography passed through generations without writing. Vikings reached Greenland and Iceland, demonstrating that northern maritime cultures achieved remarkable feats. But genetic evidence suggests population mixing across distances that seem implausible without sophisticated navigation. Artifacts appear far from their origins, indicating trade networks or travel that required capabilities we don't attribute to cultures of those periods. What would sophisticated Arctic navigation require? Understanding stellar navigation from high latitudes where familiar constellations behave differently, knowledge of ocean currents, seasonal ice patterns, and how leads in pack ice open and close. Robust vessels capable of surviving conditions that destroy modern ships. Some researchers suggest certain cultures possessed magnetic sense or used biomagnetic cues, allowing navigation when stars were obscured. The techniques sound impossible until you consider that Polynesians successfully used techniques Western science initially dismissed as fantasy. References in ancient texts describe northern voyages that conventional history considers mythological. The Greek explorer Pytheas supposedly reached Thule, possibly Iceland or northern Norway, around 325 BCE, describing the midnight sun and sea that could be neither walked nor sailed, possibly encountering pack ice. His accounts were dismissed as fabrication for centuries, until archaeological evidence confirmed people did reach those locations. How many other mythological voyages were actual journeys to places later forgotten? Here's what changes the equation. 12,000 years ago, sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. Coastlines looked entirely different. Land bridges connected regions now separated by ocean. Island chains existed where there's only open water now. Impossible ancient voyages become feasible when you reconstruct the geography that actually existed. Routes we consider wildly ambitious might have been shorter hops between now submerged islands. Maritime cultures could have developed along coasts that are currently underwater, leaving no archaeological trace. If polar regions were habitable during warm periods, cultures there would develop navigation out of necessity. Arctic survival requires reading ice patterns, understanding seasonal variations, and navigating by stars during extended twilight when the sun barely sets. Climate catastrophe forcing populations south would disperse this navigational knowledge. Suddenly, temperate cultures would possess maritime capabilities they shouldn't have developed themselves. They'd carry traditions of northern voyages, encoded in myth. They'd retain techniques for navigating conditions they no longer encountered. And we'd find evidence of ocean crossings that seem impossible for cultures at their supposed developmental stage, because the knowledge didn't originate with them, it came from somewhere colder, somewhere that no longer exists in the form it once did. On Russia's Kola Peninsula, massive stones rise from the landscape with cuts too precise, surfaces too flat, drill marks too consistent. Local tradition dates them to medieval times, but nobody's performed scientific dating. The marks on these stones match those found on Egyptian obelisks from 3000 BCE. Similar cutting techniques separated by millennia or continents shouldn't exist unless knowledge transferred between them, or unless both inherited techniques from earlier sources. The question isn't whether these structures are sophisticated, they demonstrably are. The question is why nobody wants to establish when they were actually built. The White Sea region contains stone labyrinths and structures, showing geometric understanding that required surveying capabilities and mathematical planning. Ancient Siberian sites reveal metallurgy, organized settlements, and engineering achievements that challenge assumptions about northern cultures being primitive peripheries of southern civilizations. These weren't simple survival camps. They were communities with advanced material culture, working stone and metal, creating structures aligned to astronomical phenomena, demonstrating capabilities conventional history doesn't acknowledge. Engineering in Arctic conditions presents challenges that make temperate construction seem simple by comparison. Permafrost creates unstable foundations unless you understand its behavior. Stoneworking tools fail in extreme cold using conventional techniques. Transport of massive stones across ice and snow requires methods we'd struggle to replicate. Yet structures exist, proving ancient peoples solved these problems. The Romans built hypercoursed heating systems that worked effectively in Britain despite cold climate. Vikings constructed permanent settlements in Greenland and Iceland, adapting Mediterranean architectural principles to Arctic extremes. Ancient Siberian communities thrived in conditions we consider barely habitable. The Sami people developed reindeer management systems, representing complex ecological knowledge, tracking migration patterns, understanding breeding cycles, managing herds across vast territories. Indigenous Arctic architecture achieves thermal efficiency through aerodynamic snow load distribution and innovative use of materials. Rock structures throughout northern regions incorporate acoustic properties, astronomical alignments, and landscape integration, suggesting planning and purpose beyond simple survival shelters. These weren't random constructions. They were engineered with specific intentions requiring observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge. But here's where it becomes interesting. If warm periods made Arctic regions genuinely habitable, not survival zones but places where cultures could thrive, what scale of construction becomes possible? Reduced ice extent exposes bedrock for quarrying. Warmer temperatures extend construction seasons. Abundant resources from land and sea support larger populations capable of organized projects. The engineering sophistication we see in verified northern sites might represent remnants of more extensive traditions developed during optimal climate periods. The preservation problem can't be ignored. Structures built during warm periods face advancing ice during glaciation. Ice sheets don't preserve, they destroy through grinding pressure, freeze-thaw cycles, and sheer moving mass. What could survive? Only the most massive foundations. Only structures in protected locations where ice flowed around rather than through them. Only things buried deeply enough that glaciers passed overhead without pulverizing them. Everything else would be erased, leaving only puzzling fragments suggesting capabilities greater than surviving evidence directly proves. Many verified megalithic sites worldwide lack clear builders or construction dating. We can date when they were last modified, when people added or changed elements, but not original construction. The assumption is they're roughly as old as the cultures found using them. But that's assumption, not measurement. Some structures might be far older than attributed, built during periods we don't associate with that level of sophistication, by cultures that left no other trace. There are controversial claims about Arctic engineering, underwater stone structures, mountain formations, some interpret as artificial, cave systems supposedly engineered for acoustic properties. Most lack definitive evidence. Geological explanations usually fit better than artificial construction theories. But the verified achievements remain. Precisely cut megaliths, sophisticated geometric structures, engineering solutions to Arctic challenges, demonstrating capabilities that required knowledge, planning, and technical skill. The traditional narrative presents northern peoples as peripheries, primitive cultures struggling in harsh environments, less developed than southern civilizations. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Northern engineering was sophisticated, adapted to unique challenges, and achieved results that required accumulated knowledge and systematic approach. If warm periods provided opportunities for more extensive development, the engineering traditions we find in fragments might represent echoes of more substantial accomplishments, most evidence lost to advancing ice that grinds monuments back into anonymous bedrock, leaving only questions about who built what remains, and when they actually did it. Medieval alchemical manuscripts are strange documents. They speak in riddles about phoenixes and prima materia, dragons devouring their tails, marriages of sun and moon. Modern chemists reading them recognize something underneath the symbolism: actual chemistry, distillation procedures, acid-base reactions, metallurgical processes. Knowledge encoded so deeply in myth that practitioners themselves might not have understood they were doing science. The formulas worked even when the philosophy seemed like nonsense, which raises an uncomfortable question. If esoteric traditions preserved real chemistry hidden as mythology, what else might they preserve? The Hermetic tradition, flowering in Renaissance Europe, claimed inheritance from ancient Egyptian wisdom, but threaded through Hermetic texts are references to northern sources Thule as a repository of primordial knowledge, a place where wisdom existed before Mediterranean civilizations arose. John Dee, mathematician and occultist to Queen Elizabeth, sought northern wisdom traditions. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's occult philosophy referenced Arctic sources of power. These weren't primitive superstitions. These were Renaissance intellectuals, people doing actual mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, claiming that crucial knowledge originated in the north. Freemasonry incorporates northern symbolism into its deepest mysteries. The North Star appears as a symbol of constancy, divine guidance, the fixed point around which everything rotates. Certain ritual degrees reference sacred northern geography and claim preservation of wisdom from antediluvian times, from before the flood, from civilizations that existed when the world was configured differently. The symbolism is consistent across lodges, separated by centuries and continents. Either this represents pure invention, or it encodes something passed down through initiatory chains, preserved even when original meaning was forgotten. The 19th century saw explosion of occult interest in northern origins. Theosophy's elaborate cosmology described root races and spiritual evolution, with significant northern components. Madame Blavatsky claimed ancient knowledge was preserved in Arctic regions and referenced Shambhala, a northern wisdom center. Anthroposophy developed theories about Atlantis and Hyperborea as stages of human spiritual development. These systems mixed genuine esoteric learning with romantic speculation and, unfortunately, provided material that Nazi occultists would twist into Aryan supremacy theories. We need to distinguish carefully. Historical, esoteric traditions, potentially preserving knowledge, later romantic inventions, projecting contemporary desires onto imagined ancestors, and deliberate racist misappropriation of mythology for political purposes are three different things. But here's what's interesting. Esoteric traditions demonstrably have preserved real knowledge encoded in symbolic form. Alchemical texts contained actual chemistry. Hermetic astronomical documents recorded accurate celestial observations attributed to mythical Egyptian sages. Kabbalistic mathematics explored number theory concepts that mainstream mathematics wouldn't formalize until centuries later. The mechanism works. Encode knowledge in symbols, myths, and rituals, and it survives even when original meaning is forgotten. Later initiates can recover meaning through new interpretations or comparison with emerging evidence. The Rosicrucian manifestos, appearing in 17th century Europe, claimed their order's wisdom came from multiple sources: Arabian sages, African knowledge, but also referenced northern origins. The Arthurian legends situate ultimate wisdom in northern islands. Avalon, where Arthur rests, draws on Celtic traditions with possible Arctic cultural influences. Across Western esotericism, the North consistently represents primordial wisdom, hidden knowledge, the place where secrets originated. The North Star functions as axis of spiritual development, fixed point of truth around which illusions rotate. This symbolism appears too consistently across too many separate traditions to be coincidence. Either multiple groups independently invented the same associations, or they're drawing on something deeper cultural memory, perhaps, of when northern regions actually were knowledge centers, when Arctic peoples possessed sophisticated understanding that refugees carried south and encoded in forms that would survive. We know esoteric preservation works for chemistry and astronomy. The question is, what else it might preserve? If advanced civilization existed in polar regions during warm periods, developed sophisticated knowledge, then dispersed when climate catastrophe struck, how would that knowledge survive in recipient cultures? Not as clear history that's too vulnerable to disruption, but as mythology, symbol, ritual encoded forms that can be transmitted even when nobody fully understands what they're transmitting. The initiate receives symbols whose meaning they must discover, and sometimes, comparing those symbols with evidence emerging from ice cores and archaeological sites, meaning suddenly crystallizes that's been waiting there for thousands of years, preserved in myths about northern wisdom that we dismissed as fantasy because we'd forgotten the North was ever anything but frozen wasteland where nothing sophisticated could exist. Ancient sources say Pythagoras studied with Hyperborean teachers before returning to Greece with revolutionary mathematical and philosophical insights. We dismiss this as myth because Hyperborea is myth. But that's circular reasoning. What if Hyperborea became mythological because we forgot it was real? What if we're reading historical accounts as fantasy simply because they reference a civilization whose existence we don't accept? The Greeks acknowledged learning from northern sources more than we typically recognize. Diogenes Laertius, writing biographies of philosophers, records multiple instances of Greek thinkers traveling north or studying with northern teachers. Plato references northern wisdom in dialogues we still read. Apollonius of Tyana's legendary journeys included northern peoples he sought specifically for their knowledge. These weren't casual mentions. They were claims about where fundamental insights originated. The mechanisms for contact existed. Amber trade routes connected the Mediterranean with Baltic regions, creating channels for more than just commerce. Archaeological evidence shows Bronze Age and Classical period travel was more extensive than conventional history suggests. Linguistic evidence indicates contact between Indo-European groups that would facilitate knowledge transmission. Greek writings about northern phenomena, the midnight sun, polar darkness, lands where night lasts months, suggest some Greeks possessed direct or second-hand knowledge of Arctic conditions. They weren't just imagining these places. Someone had been there and reported back. Specific philosophical concepts carry hints of northern origin. The doctrine of metempsychosis, transmigration of souls, reincarnation, appears in Greek philosophy in ways that suggest it entered from external sources. Some scholars trace it to Scythian or further northern traditions. Cosmological models, featuring axis mundi, world tree concepts connecting levels of reality, appear in both Greek philosophy and northern traditions, in forms too similar to be coincidental. Mathematical and geometric knowledge appearing in early Greek thought lacks clear developmental history. It seems to arrive fully formed from somewhere else. The Druids complicate the picture further. Roman writers, particularly Caesar, describe Druidic education as extensive and rigorous, requiring 20 years of memorization. Druidic teachings supposedly included natural philosophy, astronomy, theology, sophisticated intellectual traditions. Some sources claim Druidic wisdom predated Greek philosophy and influenced Pythagorean thought. The challenge is that Druids deliberately avoided writing their teachings down, maintaining purely oral transmission. So we depend on Greek and Roman sources of varying reliability, describing traditions they didn't fully understand. If advanced civilization existed in northern regions during warm periods, its philosophical and scientific knowledge would disperse through refugee populations and trade contacts. Mediterranean cultures receiving these ideas might not recognize their northern origin. They'd assume they were discovering things themselves when they were actually recovering knowledge transmitted from elsewhere. The insights would seem like breakthroughs when they were actually remembering. There's a pattern scholars call philosophical convergence, widely separated cultures developing remarkably similar concepts. Cosmic cycles and eternal recurrence appear in Greek, Indian, and Norse traditions. Cosmological models of world trees, axis mundi, levels of reality show up across geographically separated peoples. Mathematical mystical traditions, treating numbers as fundamental reality, emerge independently in multiple places. The conventional explanation is universal patterns in human thought, similar brains producing similar ideas. But there are alternatives. Common origin from earlier shared tradition, or knowledge transmission through contacts more extensive than generally acknowledged. The amber routes ran north. The sea routes existed. The Greeks travelled and traded far more widely than their surviving literature fully documents. If northern knowledge centres existed during warm periods, if sophisticated astronomical and mathematical learning developed there, if philosophical systems emerged from peoples observing Arctic skies and developing cosmologies based on polar celestial mechanics, then climate catastrophe forcing populations south would create exactly what we find. Philosophical concepts appearing in Mediterranean thought, without clear developmental history, attributed to mythical northern teachers, we consider imaginary, incorporating celestial observations that make most sense from northern perspectives. Pythagoras supposedly learned from Hyperborean teachers. Maybe he did. Maybe the mathematics he brought back, the mystical numerology, the cosmic harmonies, the geometric proofs, originated with people observing stars from latitudes where celestial mechanics behave differently, where the pole star truly is center of the universe, fixed point around which everything rotates. Maybe what we call Greek philosophy contains significant northern contributions that we've forgotten were contributions because we forgot the north ever had anything to contribute. The sources say he travelled north and returned transformed. Perhaps we should take them literally, rather than assuming everything about the north must be mythology simply because we lost track of when it was history. Siberian shamans have used specific plants to induce healing trances for thousands of years. In the 1,970 seconds, neuroscientists analyzing these plants discovered they contain compounds affecting serotonin receptors in ways modern medicine barely understands even now. The shamans didn't know about neurochemistry. They didn't have laboratories or controlled trials. Yet somehow they identified the right plants, determined correct dosages, understood contraindications, and synergistic effects. The standard explanation is trial and error over generations. But that explanation requires assuming random experimentation that should have killed people before stumbling on safe protocols. There's another possibility. They inherited knowledge from someone who understood more systematically what they were doing. Arctic shamanism represents humanity's oldest spiritual and healing tradition. Many researchers consider it the most archaic form, potentially closest to original shamanic practice from which other traditions descended. What these systems contain is remarkable when you examine closely. Sophisticated understanding of medicinal plants and their psychoactive or therapeutic properties, psychological techniques for achieving altered consciousness that modern neurology validates as genuine neurological phenomena, detailed ecological knowledge of Arctic environments, animal behavior, resource management, astronomical knowledge embedded in myths and seasonal rituals, healing practices that, while framed spiritually, demonstrate accurate understanding of anatomy, medicine, psychology. The Sami Noaidi, their shamans, possessed encyclopedic knowledge of reindeer behavior, ecology, and medicine. Modern zoology studying reindeer has largely validated what Noaidi already knew: migration patterns, nutritional requirements, disease symptoms, breeding timing. Siberian shamanic traditions encoded sophisticated pharmacology using native plants, understanding which plants affect which conditions, how to prepare them, what combinations enhance or negate effects. Arctic shamanic astronomy, tracked through mythological stories, contains accurate celestial observations, useful for navigation and timekeeping. These aren't primitive superstitions, they're knowledge systems that work. The question is where this knowledge originated. The conventional answer: accumulation within indigenous traditions through patient observation and experimentation over millennia. That's certainly part of it. But there are elements that seem oddly sophisticated for trial and error development. Shamanic initiation is described as receiving teachings from spirits or ancient ones. Anthropologists interpret this as cultural learning encoded in visionary experience. The initiate hallucinates, but the hallucinations contain real knowledge transmitted through expectation and cultural framework. But consider another interpretation. If Arctic regions previously held more technologically advanced cultures, their knowledge might have been transmitted to subsequent indigenous populations in forms that survived as shamanic tradition. What initiates describe as spirits teaching them might encode actual knowledge transfer from earlier peoples, preserved in visionary frameworks, because that's what survived when technological context was lost. Ethnobotanical studies repeatedly reveal that indigenous peoples' traditional plant knowledge includes uses requiring understanding of complex biochemistry, astronomical knowledge in myths that couldn't be discovered through casual observation, but requires systematic long-term study. Healing techniques modern medicine validates through scientific investigation, sometimes discovering indigenous peoples already knew what researchers thought they were discovering for the first time. Willow bark for pain relief, containing salicylic acid that's the basis of aspirin, used across multiple cultures. Understanding of plant-plant interactions and synergistic effects in herbal medicines that chemistry only recently explains. Psychological techniques for treating trauma and mental illness that modern psychology keeps rediscovering. Arctic shamanic traditions might preserve knowledge in two ways simultaneously: as accumulation of systematic observation and experimentation by indigenous peoples themselves over thousands of years, and potentially as inheritance from earlier sophisticated cultures, preserved in mythological and ritual form when technological context disappeared. These aren't mutually exclusive. Indigenous knowledge is genuine, sophisticated, developed through real intellectual work. That doesn't preclude it also containing elements of even older wisdom, transmitted from peoples who inhabited Arctic regions during warm periods and possessed different technological approaches. The shamans know things that work. They knew before scientists explained why they work. The mechanisms of preservation, oral tradition, initiatory transmission, encoding in myth and ritual, are proven to maintain knowledge across time periods that would erase written records. Whether that knowledge developed entirely within indigenous traditions or includes elements inherited from predecessors might be less important than recognizing that Arctic peoples possessed and maintained sophisticated understanding that conventional history systematically underestimated because it came wrapped in spiritual frameworks rather than scientific terminology. In 1938, Nazi Germany dispatched expeditions to Tibet, seeking the origins of the Aryan race in mountain monasteries and ancient texts. It was pseudoscience weaponized for genocide, racial mythology masquerading as archaeology. The expeditions found nothing because they were looking for something that never existed, a pure Aryan lineage, validating their murderous ideology. But strip away the racism and politics, and there's an interesting question underneath. Did sophisticated ancient northern cultures exist? In 2015, Russian scientists discovered an 11,000-year-old complex structure in the Arctic, sophisticated enough to require organized labor and planning. The Nazis were looking in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions, serving evil purposes. But the core idea that ancient northern sites exist, that part wasn't wrong. 19th century Arctic exploration focused on practical goals: the Northwest Passage, the North Pole, mapping uncharted territories. Yet some explorers knew Hyperborean legends and watched for evidence of ancient habitation. They encountered mysteries: the Thule and Dorset cultures, sophisticated Arctic peoples whose origins archaeology was only beginning to recognize. Early explorers found ruins, artifacts, and evidence of long habitation in regions they'd assumed were eternally empty. The 20th century brought expeditions with specific interest in ancient northern civilizations. Russian expeditions to the Kola Peninsula in the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds investigated megalithic structures, seeking evidence of sophisticated ancient cultures. Soviet archaeological work in Siberia uncovered genuinely significant sites, though sometimes interpreted through ideological frameworks that served state purposes rather than science. And yes, German expeditions in the 1930 seconds and 1940 seconds searched for Aryan origins in northern regions. We need to examine these critically. They were politically motivated pseudoscience, seeking validation for predetermined conclusions. Their methods were compromised, their interpretations twisted to serve ideology. That some of the sites they investigated turned out to be genuinely ancient doesn't validate their racist theories any more than accidentally correct statements validate astrology. Post-Soviet Russia has seen renewed Hyperborea interest. Organizations like the Hyperborea Foundation conduct expeditions to the Kola Peninsula, the Seda Zero area, and other northern sites. They've claimed discoveries: pyramids, observatories, ancient structures. Mainstream archaeology disputes most of these interpretations. The challenge is distinguishing between genuine archaeological anomalies requiring investigation, natural geological formations misinterpreted as artificial, and deliberate hoaxes or exaggerations. Some claimed pyramids are erosion-shaped mountains. Some underwater formations lack definitive archaeological confirmation. Some ancient observatory claims turn out to be natural rock formations with coincidental alignments. But not everything is misinterpretation. Technology enables genuinely new searches. Satellite imagery reveals potential archaeological features beneath ice. Ground-penetrating radar detects structures under permafrost. Ice melt exposes previously hidden sites. LiDAR and remote sensing technologies allow survey of vast Arctic territories that were previously inaccessible. These tools work. They've located hundreds of real archaeological sites, some of genuine significance. Legitimate scientific Arctic archaeology proceeds quietly, while enthusiasts make bold claims. Well-documented excavations of Thule, Dorset, and earlier cultures reveal sophisticated adaptation to extreme environments. Paleoclimatic studies confirm that polar regions were indeed habitable during warm periods. Serious research into human Arctic presence over millennia produces peer-reviewed findings that rarely make headlines, but steadily push back timelines of northern habitation and sophistication. There's tension in this field. Enthusiastic amateur researchers make bold claims based on limited evidence, seeing patterns everywhere and artificial structures in natural formations. Mainstream archaeologists may be too conservative, dismissing anomalies rather than investigating them, protecting reputations by avoiding controversial sites. And underlying everything is the reality that Arctic archaeology is dramatically underfunded and understudied compared to Mediterranean or Near Eastern regions. Many potential sites have never received professional investigation. They sit unexplored not because archaeologists think they're unimportant, but because there's no funding, no institutional support, and limited career incentive to work in extreme conditions, investigating cultures that don't fit conventional narratives. Some expeditions are sincere, but lack methodology. Some are publicity stunts. Some are ideologically motivated. But the general principle isn't unsound. Arctic regions contain unexamined archaeological sites potentially revealing sophisticated ancient cultures. The fact that many specific Hyperborea expeditions lack scientific rigor doesn't mean the search itself is invalid. It means we need better science, more resources, and less sensationalism. The Arctic is opening. Ice that has hidden landscapes for millennia is retreating. Sites that were inaccessible are becoming reachable. The timing is urgent. Exposed sites deteriorate quickly, and artifacts can be lost before documentation. We need serious, well-funded, methodologically sound archaeological programs systematically investigating northern regions. Not because we'll necessarily find Hyperborea, That name carries too much mythological baggage, but because we'll find what was actually there. The real ancient peoples, their real capabilities, their real sophistication. And maybe discovering what truly existed in the ancient Arctic is more interesting than any myth we've projected onto it. In 2010, a graduate student reviewing Google Earth imagery of Greenland noticed something unusual: geometric patterns suggesting buried structures in an area no expedition had surveyed. Ground investigation confirmed it. A significant Norse site, missed by every previous exploration. The structures had been there for centuries, invisible from ground level, waiting for someone to look from above. Every year now, satellites reveal dozens of new Arctic archaeological sites. This isn't future possibility. It's happening now, and we've barely begun to look. The revolution in Arctic archaeology runs on technology that didn't exist a generation ago. LiDAR reveals landscape features invisible at ground level, subtle depressions and elevations that resolve into building foundations, road systems, and settlement patterns when viewed from above. Satellite imagery detects variations in vegetation or snow cover, indicating buried structures. Different materials beneath the surface affect how plants grow or how snow accumulates. Ground-penetrating radar images what lies under ice or permafrost without excavation. Multispectral imaging identifies chemical signatures of human habitation, detecting soil changes from ancient agriculture or metallurgy. The verified discoveries keep accumulating. Hundreds of previously unknown archaeological sites mapped across the Arctic. Ancient travel routes visible from above as subtle landscape modifications, paths used so consistently over centuries that vegetation patterns changed. Buried structures in Greenland, Siberia, and northern Canada now being excavated, many showing sophistication that surprises investigators. Norse settlements, Thule culture sites, earlier habitations in locations that would be impossible to survey on foot, found by someone at a computer scrolling through satellite data. But satellite imagery also generates controversy. Claims about pyramids in Antarctica, visible in Google Earth, circulate online, typically natural mountain peaks, whose geometric appearance results from glacial erosion, creating sharp edges. Allegations of structures in Greenland ice often turn out to be natural geological features or artifacts of image processing. Assertions about hidden bases or ancient sites based on unusual features in satellite photos populate conspiracy forums. The technology that enables discovery also enables misinterpretation. Understanding what satellites actually show requires literacy. Unusual features can result from shadows, melting patterns, geological structures, or image compression artifacts. Something appearing geometric doesn't mean it's artificial. Nature creates plenty of straight lines and right angles through crystallization, fracturing, and erosion. The difference between potentially archaeological features and natural formations often requires ground truthing. You cannot confirm anything from satellite imagery alone. Consider specific cases. The Antarctica pyramids appear distinctly geometric in certain satellite photos. Geologists examining them explain their glacially eroded mountains. Ice grinding against rock creates pyramid shapes through predictable mechanical processes. Features in the Canadian Arctic appeared artificial in satellite imagery. Investigation revealed they were natural, but adjacent to them were actual previously unknown archaeological sites the satellite survey helped locate. Landscape patterns in Siberia visible from space helped archaeologists position excavations that confirmed ancient settlements. The patterns were real. The interpretation required verification. Climate change makes satellite archaeology both more urgent and more promising. Ice melt exposes previously hidden surfaces. Permafrost degradation reveals buried features. Seasonal snow patterns become more variable, creating windows where features become temporarily visible. What was covered for millennia might be exposed for one summer before deteriorating. The opportunity is brief. Satellites reveal information about past climate in polar regions that contextualizes human habitation. Ancient shorelines now high above or below current sea level, showing when ocean levels were dramatically different. Vegetation patterns indicating formerly forested areas where only tundra exists today. Geological features suggesting different hydrological systems, rivers that no longer flow, lakes that have vanished, coastlines that have transformed. If advanced civilization existed in Arctic regions during warm periods, what might satellites reveal? City plans organize settlement patterns visible as geometric arrangements, road networks, linear features connecting centers of habitation, Harbour structures, artificial modifications to coastlines, agricultural patterns, field systems and irrigation, but only if we recognize them when we see them. Archaeological features persist across millennia while being invisible at ground level. Earthwork modifications alter drainage, vegetation, or snow accumulation in ways that create visible patterns from above. Stone alignments create linear features. Foundations create microtopographic variations. The challenge is distinguishing signal from noise. Ongoing programs systematically survey polar regions with satellite technology. The rate of Arctic archaeological discovery has increased exponentially. Most finds are conventional Thule culture sites, Norse settlements, Dorset habitations. These are significant discoveries advancing understanding of Arctic history. They're just not evidence of advanced ancient civilization. Not yet. Anyway, the satellite data exists. Someone needs to analyze it systematically, with archaeological training and understanding of northern geography, looking specifically for anomalies indicating earlier, more sophisticated habitation. The graduate student finding that Greenland site wasn't using specialized equipment or classified imagery. She was using Google Earth, publicly available, scrolling through data anyone can access. How many more sites are sitting in satellite archives right now, visible to anyone who knows what to look for and takes the time to search? In 1991, hikers in the Alps discovered a body emerging from melting ice. Ötzi the Iceman had died 5,300 years ago, carrying a copper axe, wearing sophisticated layered clothing, and possessing medicinal plants, indicating knowledge of herbal medicine. The ice preserved everything: his skin, his organs, his last meal partially digested in his stomach. He wasn't supposed to be there. Copper Age people weren't supposed to be in high mountains with advanced equipment. But the evidence was undeniable, frozen perfectly, contradicting assumptions about primitive ancient peoples. Right now, under retreating Arctic glaciers, there might be dozens more bodies. Each one a time capsule of ancient knowledge, ancient capabilities, ancient sophistication we don't know existed, because the ice hasn't released them yet. Ice preservation provides what normal archaeology never recovers. Organic materials survive that normally decompose within years. Wood, leather, plant fibers, textiles, even food. Bodies are naturally mummified, soft tissue preserved for analysis. DNA survives in excellent condition. Artifacts remain in use context, exactly where they were dropped or abandoned, rather than disturbed by later human activity or natural processes. Norwegian glaciers have released Viking equipment with leather straps intact, wooden handles unrotted, textiles showing weaving patterns. Weapons, clothing, and tools from various periods appear in melting mountain passes, revealing routes used for thousands of years. Systematic ice patch archaeology programs now monitor melting ice specifically for emerging artifacts. It's time-sensitive work. Artifacts exposed by melt can decompose within months of exposure. Once protected for millennia, organic materials deteriorate rapidly in air, water, and sunlight. Recovery teams race against deterioration, documenting and extracting finds before they're lost. The discoveries reveal sophisticated equipment, extensive trade networks, and capabilities that keep expanding our understanding of ancient peoples. Arctic ice melt produces specific discoveries. Ancient hunting grounds in northern Canada reveal Ice Age survival strategies more sophisticated than expected. Tools and weapons from various periods show technological evolution and adaptation. Evidence of ancient trade routes appears. Artifacts from distant origins, thousands of kilometers from their source, indicating either extensive travel or elaborate exchange networks. What might emerge as polar ice continues melting? Larger structures that have been under ice for millennia. Preserved settlements from warm periods now buried under glaciers. Organic evidence, food, clothing, wooden artifacts from cultures we know only through stone tools and bone. Potentially, bodies of ancient people caught by sudden climate change, individuals like Ötzi but from Arctic contexts, carrying evidence of northern sophistication. There's urgency in this work. Climate change accelerates ice melt faster than archaeology can respond. Once exposed, organic materials deteriorate rapidly. Years of preservation can be lost in months of exposure. Looters and casual finders disturb sites before professional documentation. Meltwater washes evidence away. The window for recovery is brief and narrowing. Ice cores tell complementary stories. Ash layers indicate volcanic eruptions and their timing. Pollen reveals vegetation changes, showing when regions were forested or covered in tundra. Chemical signatures detect metallurgy and agriculture airborne particles from smelting or land clearing, preserved in annual ice layers. Microparticles suggest human activity at specific periods. The ice records human presence even when artifacts haven't emerged. The controversial question persists. What if major structures or cities lie under polar ice caps, preserved but inaccessible? Realistic assessment is necessary. Antarctic ice is kilometers thick, unlikely to hide inhabited structures from recent enough periods to be relevant. Greenland ice similarly covers most land too deeply for surface structures to remain accessible. But there are ice-free coastal areas, regions where ice formed only in recent millennia, bedrock highs that might have remained above ice during formation. Recent subglacial discoveries hint at possibilities. Lakes under Antarctic ice contain unique ecosystems. Mountain ranges mapped beneath ice using radar prove substantial land masses exist under glaciers. Evidence shows some areas now ice-covered were exposed during recent warm periods not millions of years ago, but within the time frame of human habitation. Ice melt archaeology will likely produce incremental rather than revolutionary discoveries, more Ötzi-like finds, additional tools and artifacts, perhaps preserved structures or settlements, not lost cities emerging dramatically from retreating glaciers, but steady accumulation of evidence showing sophisticated ancient northern cultures, preserved by cold, now revealed by warming. Each discovery pushes back timelines. Each artifact demonstrates capabilities we didn't attribute to ancient peoples. The melting continues, the evidence emerges. We just need to be there when it appears, ready to document what the ice has been hiding. When archaeologists discovered the Dorset culture in the 1920 seconds, an Arctic people who vanished mysteriously around 1500 CE, Inuit elders responded without surprise. "We told you about them," they said. "We've always known they were here." The traditions called them the Tuniat. Stories described their physical appearance, their different hunting methods, their powerful magic, their strange dwellings. Archaeologists had dismissed these stories as mythology. Then excavations revealed everything the oral traditions claimed: a distinct culture, different technology, different housing styles, occupying the Arctic before Inuit arrival. The traditions were right. The scientists were wrong to dismiss them. So the question becomes, what else are they right about? Oral tradition preserves information across timescales that seem impossible. Aboriginal Australian songlines encode geological events from over 10,000 years ago. Volcanic eruptions, sea level changes, landscape formations now validated by modern geology. Indigenous Pacific Islander navigational knowledge contains centuries of astronomical and oceanographic observation, transmitted without writing but accurate enough to guide voyages across thousands of miles. Native American oral histories describe megafauna and landscape features from the end of the Ice Age, confirmed by paleontology, showing these animals and features existed exactly when and where the stories claim. Arctic oral traditions contain specific accounts about previous inhabitants. Inuit stories about the Tuniat include cultural details. Archaeology later confirmed their hunting techniques, their dwelling construction, even approximate timeline of their disappearance. Sami traditions describe peoples who preceded them, associated with building Sedas, sacred stone structures, and possessing different knowledge about astronomy and the land. Chukchi and other Siberian peoples maintain legends about ancient peoples displaced by climate changes or disasters, forced to migrate when conditions became unsuitable. These traditions distinguish between different types of knowledge. Mythological stories about gods and spirits are clearly framed as sacred narratives, operating in spiritual rather than historical time. But accounts of previous inhabitants are presented differently as actual events remembered by ancestors, historical occurrences within human time. Indigenous peoples maintain clear categories. Western observers who lump everything together as myth miss these distinctions. Some traditions specifically describe climate change, stories about times when the Arctic was warmer, when different animals lived there, when the sea was in different locations, accounts of catastrophic climate changes forcing migration or lifestyle transformation, memories of specific landscape features that existed before ice advanced or sea levels changed. Modern science increasingly validates these accounts. Geological evidence confirms sea level changes described in oral histories. Archaeological discoveries of past inhabitants match traditional descriptions. Climate reconstructions support oral tradition timelines of warm and cold periods. Inuit knowledge of Viking settlements in the Arctic was preserved through oral tradition. long before archaeological confirmation. Stories described where the Norse had lived, what they built, how they differed from other peoples. When archaeologists finally investigated these locations, they found exactly what the traditions indicated. Sami traditions reference ancient astronomical sites, specific locations with unusual properties, knowledge attributed to peoples who came before. Archaeologists investigating some of these sites find evidence of intentional construction and astronomical alignments, predating Sami presence. The challenge is interpreting these traditions respectfully and accurately. Colonial history includes systematic dismissal of indigenous knowledge as primitive myth, refusing to credit indigenous peoples with sophisticated understanding. We need to avoid that tendency, while also recognizing that oral traditions encode knowledge differently than written history. They require cultural context to interpret properly. They operate by different rules than academic historical writing. Indigenous peoples are authorities on their own traditions. External researchers should approach as learners, not judges. If advanced Arctic civilization existed during warm periods, subsequent indigenous peoples occupying those regions would encounter remnants, ruins partially buried or eroded, artifacts exposed by shifting landscapes, possibly even degraded survivors from the collapsed civilization, carrying knowledge they couldn't fully maintain without their original social structure and technology. These encounters would be preserved as traditions about the ancient ones, the people who came before, those who were here first. That's exactly the pattern found in Arctic oral traditions across multiple cultures. Not vague mythology, but specific historical accounts about previous inhabitants who possessed different knowledge, built structures that remain as ruins, and occupied lands before climate changes forced displacement. These accounts deserve serious consideration as historical evidence, particularly when archaeology keeps confirming what the traditions maintained all along. The Dorset existed. The traditions said so, and they were right. What else have the traditions been saying that we haven't yet confirmed, because we haven't looked properly? Because we assumed indigenous knowledge was folklore rather than history? Because we privileged written records over oral transmission despite oral tradition, proving itself accurate across timescales longer than writing has existed? A Sami elder stood at a specific stone alignment in northern Scandinavia, describing it to researchers as an ancient knowledge place built by the first people. He explained what it was for marking the winter solstice sunrise, used for tracking the year and understanding when to move herds. Archaeoastronomers investigated. The alignment did mark winter solstice sunrise with precision. Carbon dating and archaeological context showed it predated Sami arrival in the region by 2,000 years. The elder was right about what it did and who built it. The question researchers asked next was, how did he know? Because my ancestors told me, he said. We've kept the knowledge. Indigenous Arctic traditions explicitly attribute certain knowledge to earlier peoples. Specific hunting techniques claim to have been taught by previous inhabitants. Astronomical knowledge said to derive from the ancient ones. Locations of resources or sacred sites known because the old ones showed us. Healing practices attributed to knowledge received from those who came before. These aren't vague references, they're specific attributions, indicating awareness of knowledge sources external to the culture preserving it. How do we interpret these attributions? Several possibilities exist. Indigenous peoples might attribute their own accumulated knowledge to ancestors to give it authority and importance. Claiming knowledge comes from the ancient ones might be a way of saying, this is very old and very important. That's certainly part of it. But there's also evidence of actual knowledge transfer from earlier Arctic inhabitants. The Dorset preceded the Inuit. The archaeological transition shows overlap period when both cultures occupied overlapping territories. Knowledge transfer during such periods would be expected, not surprising. Some traditions are remarkably specific. Inuit accounts describe certain stone structures and cairns as built by previous inhabitants for navigation or astronomical purposes. Modern investigation sometimes confirms these predate Inuit presence and show intentional construction for the purposes described. Sami knowledge includes sites with unusual properties, acoustic resonance, specific astronomical alignments attributed to ancient peoples who understood the land differently. Investigation reveals some of these sites do possess the properties claimed and show evidence of intentional engineering. Siberian peoples' traditions about metallurgical techniques learned from earlier inhabitants are supported by archaeological evidence of ancient metalworking in regions where conventional timelines say it shouldn't exist. This represents technological inheritance when one culture acquires techniques from predecessors or neighbors. It creates layered knowledge systems where older techniques survive within newer practices. Attribution often becomes unclear over generations. The knowledge source is forgotten while the knowledge persists. People know that a technique works, that a site is important, that specific knowledge is valuable, but the chain of transmission has been simplified to "the ancestors taught us," or "this comes from the ancient ones." Artifacts and structures from earlier peoples provide learning templates even without direct contact. A later culture encountering a sophisticated structure might not know who built it or understand all its purposes, but they can observe its construction techniques, note its astronomical alignments, recognize its significance. The knowledge transfers through the physical evidence itself. Archaeological evidence increasingly supports oral tradition claims of inherited knowledge. Sites show construction techniques suggesting knowledge of earlier building methods, not independent invention, but learning from existing examples. Astronomical alignments persist across cultural transitions. The same celestial phenomena, tracked by one culture, continue being tracked by their successors using similar methods. Specific technologies and practices continue across multiple cultural phases, indicating transmission rather than repeated independent discovery. This changes how we understand Arctic human history. Instead of successive, completely separate cultures, we see continuity and knowledge transmission. Instead of peoples reinventing everything independently, we see sophisticated learning from predecessors. Instead of lost civilizations leaving no trace, we see their knowledge persisting in traditions of subsequent inhabitants. If advanced Arctic civilization existed during warm periods and was displaced by climate change, their knowledge might survive through multiple mechanisms. Artifacts and structures provide learning templates. Direct contact between refugee populations and indigenous inhabitants transfers knowledge personally. Encoded knowledge in landscape modifications, astronomical alignments, or other persistent features teaches subsequent observers, even without human intermediaries. Indigenous Arctic peoples explicitly claim they inherited knowledge from previous inhabitants. When archaeological findings support these oral traditions, we should take them seriously as historical evidence, rather than dismissing them as folklore. The Sami elder knew about the ancient astronomical site because his ancestors told him. They told him because their ancestors told them. The chain reaches back 2,000 years, maybe longer. The knowledge survived because it mattered, because people recognized its importance and preserved it, even when they couldn't fully explain its origins. Inuit place names in the Canadian Arctic include locations called "where the forest was," barren tundra now, treeless and wind-scoured, as Arctic as landscape gets. Curious scientists took pollen core samples from these locations. The cores revealed boreal forest grew there 6,000 years ago. The memory survived 6,000 years of oral transmission, longer than writing has existed anywhere on Earth. The landscape changed completely, but the knowledge about what it used to be persisted, encoded in a place name that seemed nonsensical until science confirmed it was accurate. Landscape holds memory in forms that outlast human lifetimes. Ancient travel routes remain visible, as subtle terrain modifications, paths worn into stone, cairns marking safe passages, vegetation patterns altered by repeated use, resource locations marked by petroglyphs or stone indicators thousands of years old, place names encoding information about landscape history and former uses. The Arctic, with its permafrost and limited vegetation, preserves these features better than temperate regions where decay and growth erase evidence within decades. Arctic place names reveal patterns. Many are straightforward descriptions of current features: steep cliff, good fishing, deep water. But others reference the ancient ones, the old peoples, place, where the first people lived. Some locations are marked as significant in ways that seem disproportionate to current use, possibly preserving memory of greater importance during earlier periods. Some place names reference climate conditions different from current reality: forests in treeless areas, open water in frozen locations, harbors in places now far from shore. Modern investigation keeps validating these geographical memories. Place names referencing old port in locations now far from water match ancient shorelines revealed by geological survey showing when sea levels were different. Forest references in Arctic tundra regions align with paleobotanical evidence of past tree growth. Locations described as ancient settlement yield archaeological evidence when someone bothers investigating them. Landscape features themselves preserve information across timescales, longer than human memory. Raised beaches indicate past sea levels. Modified drainage patterns suggest past agricultural or habitation use. Rock alignments, cairns, and astronomical markers show where humans organized their environment. The Arctic's specific conditions enhance preservation. Permafrost freezes features in place, preventing decay and disturbance. Limited vegetation means surface modifications remain visible longer. Low population density reduces disturbance of ancient features. Ice advance and retreat creates archaeological stratigraphy, with features from different periods exposed in sequence as climate changes. Indigenous peoples read landscape as historical record. They recognize ancient campsites from subtle vegetation differences invisible to outsiders. They identify old travel routes from wear patterns, persisting centuries after last use. They locate resource sites through landscape knowledge passed down through generations. This isn't mysticism. It's systematic observation and knowledge transmission, reading signs in terrain, the way archaeologists read stratigraphy. What does landscape reveal about earlier Arctic inhabitants? The distribution of archaeological sites suggests more extensive habitation during certain periods than currently exists. Landscape modifications indicate organized populations capable of engineering projects. Astronomical alignments and other features demonstrate sophisticated knowledge. The pattern isn't random scattered survival camps, it's systematic occupation by peoples who understood their environment deeply and modified it intentionally. Catastrophic climate change leaves specific geographical signatures. Abandoned settlements at formerly optimal locations. Modified landscapes suddenly unsuitable for their modifications' purposes. Routes and resource sites becoming inaccessible due to ice advance or sea level change. Populations forced to abandon areas they'd invested in developing. These signatures persist as landscape anomalies, things that don't make sense in current conditions but indicate the landscape once functioned differently. Modern climate change creates new geographical memory happening in real time. Indigenous peoples experience landscape changes they'll remember and tell descendants about. Current populations become refugees from climate-changed regions, exactly as might have happened to ancient Arctic inhabitants. The Arctic transforms faster than at any time in recorded history, creating new layers of geographical memory that future generations will interpret. Reading Arctic landscape as historical text, combining indigenous geographical knowledge with modern geological and archaeological science, reveals patterns of earlier habitation and climate-forced displacement that don't appear in conventional archaeological record. The geography remembers what happened there, even when human memory has simplified complex history into place names that seem like mythology, until science confirms they're describing actual conditions from thousands of years ago. The land doesn't forget, it just waits for someone who knows how to read what it's been recording all along. Consider what happens when evidence begins to converge. A single ancient text describing a northern paradise means little. Climate data showing Arctic warmth at some point in the past proves nothing about human habitation. An oral tradition mentioning previous inhabitants could be invention. Genetic markers suggesting northern ancestry might indicate something entirely different. But when ancient sources from cultures that never contacted each other describe the same place with the same details, when paleoclimate data confirms those regions were habitable during the exact periods mentioned, when indigenous traditions align with archaeological discoveries, when genetic and linguistic evidence points in the same direction, at what point does the pattern become impossible to dismiss? The evidence we've explored throughout this investigation builds a cumulative case. No single piece proves that advanced Arctic civilization existed, but the accumulation of diverse evidence, all pointing toward the same conclusion, deserves consideration that mainstream scholarship has been reluctant to provide. Let's construct the most plausible scenario based on what we actually know. Between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, during what scientists call the Holocene climate optimum, Arctic and subarctic regions were considerably more hospitable than they are today. Temperatures were several degrees warmer. Ice coverage was reduced. Resources were more abundant. These weren't tropical paradises, but they were environments where human populations could not just survive, but potentially thrive. During this period, human populations established themselves in these northern regions. They weren't primitive hunter-gatherers stumbling through the ice. They developed cultures uniquely adapted to Arctic conditions, sophisticated in ways that warm climate civilizations never needed to be. Arctic survival demanded advanced astronomy. Understanding celestial cycles becomes literally vital when you experience months of darkness and continuous daylight. It required superior navigation skills, intimate knowledge of animal migration, and technological innovation for extreme conditions. These populations may have achieved levels of sophistication that conventional archaeology hasn't recognized because we've been looking for the wrong markers of advancement. Then, climate changed. The 8.2 kiloyear event brought sudden cooling. Later periods brought further deterioration. Polar regions became progressively less habitable. Resources dwindled. Populations faced a choice: adapt to worsening conditions or migrate southward. Many chose migration, carrying with them their knowledge, cultural practices, and memories of their homeland. These refugee populations moved into southern regions, encountering other cultures. They transmitted their knowledge, astronomical understanding, navigation techniques, architectural principles, spiritual practices. They told stories of where they came from, of a land in the far north that had once been habitable, even beautiful, before the climate turned against them. Over centuries and millennia, these stories were passed down, transformed, mythologized. Historical reality became legend. The actual northern homeland, with its real people and genuine achievements, transformed into Hyperborea, Arianem Veajo, Thule memory becoming myth, but preserving a core truth about a northern civilization lost to climate catastrophe. This scenario explains patterns that mainstream scholarship struggles to account for. It explains why cultures across Europe, Asia, and even indigenous Americas share similar myths about northern paradises, despite having no known contact. It explains how advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge appeared in ancient societies earlier than conventional development timelines would predict. It explains the persistent northern symbolism in esoteric traditions worldwide. It explains indigenous oral traditions explicitly describing previous inhabitants with different characteristics and knowledge. It explains certain genetic markers and linguistic features distributed across geographically separated populations in ways that suggest common northern origin. What would definitively prove this scenario? Substantial architectural remains discovered under Arctic ice sheets. Extensive written records from this civilization. Artifact assemblages clearly demonstrating advanced capabilities beyond what we attribute to prehistoric Arctic peoples. Decisive genetic evidence linking modern populations to a specific ancient Arctic source. This direct evidence is lacking, and honest inquiry must acknowledge that absence. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in environments where preservation is challenged by advancing and retreating ice, permafrost cycles, sea level changes, and thousands of years of geological activity. The Arctic is perhaps the least archaeologically explored region on Earth. What lies beneath the ice, beneath the permafrost, beneath risen seas, remains mostly unknown. The question isn't whether a mythological paradise called Hyperborea existed with all the supernatural features ancient texts describe. The question is whether myths about Hyperborea preserve distorted but genuine memory of sophisticated Arctic cultures that were displaced by climate change and influenced the development of civilizations to the south. This more modest claim is scientifically plausible, consistent with known paleoclimate and archaeology, and doesn't require accepting impossible elements. It simply requires taking seriously the possibility that our ancestors in the far north achieved more than we've credited them with, and that their destruction and displacement left echoes that still resonate in mythology today. Before we accept any theory about lost Arctic civilizations, we need to confront the mainstream explanations, the conventional scholarly interpretation that has dominated academic discourse for generations. According to this view, Hyperborea was pure mythology, a philosophical ideal invented by Greeks to represent perfection and provide contrast with their own imperfect society. Nothing more. This explanation has merit. The ancient Greeks had a documented tendency to situate their ideals in distant, unverifiable locations. Atlantis, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Islands of the Blessed, at the world's edge. Hyperborea, in the unreachable north. These places served philosophical functions, providing frameworks for ethical and political discussions rather than geographical descriptions of real places. When Plato described Atlantis, he was constructing a thought experiment about ideal societies and their corruption, not writing history. Perhaps Hyperborea served the same purpose, a canvas for projecting ideals rather than a memory of reality. The Greeks never systematically explored northward with the rigor they applied to other directions. Their knowledge of northern regions remained fragmentary, based on second-hand accounts and imagination. In this information vacuum, myths could flourish unchallenged by direct observation. But what about the cross-cultural parallels? The fact that cultures from Persia to India to indigenous Americas describe similar northern homelands. Mainstream scholarship offers several explanations. Indo-European peoples shared linguistic and cultural heritage, which naturally created shared mythological templates. As these populations dispersed, they carried common stories that evolved independently but retained core similarities. Cultural diffusion through ancient trade routes and population movements could have spread myths across vast distances. And there's a universal human tendency to imagine lost golden ages and perfect lands. Every culture creates its own version of Paradise Lost. Consider the archaeological evidence of Arctic sophistication. Conventional archaeology explains this through gradual indigenous development over millennia, not through inheritance from some advanced predecessor civilization. We've consistently underestimated prehistoric peoples' capabilities. As new evidence emerges, we revise our understanding upward, but that revision doesn't require invoking lost advanced civilizations. The sites we find in Arctic regions fit within conventional chronologies without needing Hyperborean refugees to explain them. The paleoclimate data is accurate. Polar regions were indeed warmer during certain periods, but warmer doesn't mean civilized. Habitation and civilization are fundamentally different things. Even during the Holocene climate optimum, the Arctic remained challenging. The environment that would have existed, still subject to extreme seasonal variations in daylight, still requiring constant adaptation to harsh conditions, might have prevented the development of what we define as civilization. Agriculture, supporting large populations, cities, writing systems, monumental architecture, complex social hierarchies. Small-scale hunter-gatherer occupation is one thing, advanced civilization is another entirely. Indigenous oral traditions about previous inhabitants can be explained conventionally. The Inuit traditions about the Tuniat reference the archaeologically known Dorset culture, not some hypothetical advanced civilization. When traditions speak of ancient ones who possessed great knowledge, this might reflect cultural transmission within indigenous societies themselves, rather than inheritance from a distinct, more advanced predecessor people. Place names, preserving memories of different climatic conditions, don't necessarily prove human habitation during those warmer periods. They might simply record environmental changes observed over generations. The anomalous evidence that seems to support Hyperborea often crumbles under scrutiny. Claimed pyramids in Arctic regions are typically natural formations. Geology can create remarkably regular shapes that appear artificial to untrained eyes. Ancient maps supposedly showing impossible knowledge of Arctic geography often result from cartographic errors, additions made by later copyists, or wishful interpretation by modern researchers seeing what they want to see. Esoteric traditions claiming northern wisdom sources are frequently later inventions with no historical basis, created to add mystique and authority to philosophical systems. The most skeptical position is straightforward. Hyperborea is mythology. Similarities across cultures result from shared Indo-European heritage and cultural diffusion. Arctic warm periods allowed habitation, but not advanced civilization. Indigenous oral traditions preserve memory of conventional archaeological cultures and climate changes, nothing more mysterious. Anomalous evidence results from misinterpretation, natural formations, or deliberate hoaxes. The apparent advanced knowledge in ancient southern cultures, their astronomy, mathematics, architecture, results from those cultures' own capabilities, developed independently over centuries, not from northern influences. These explanations are plausible. They represent mainstream scholarly consensus. They require fewer assumptions than Hyperborea theories, invoking no unproven civilizations or extraordinary claims. And yet, certain evidence resists easy conventional explanation. The remarkable consistency of cross-cultural myths, the precision of ancient astronomical knowledge, the repeated validation of oral traditions through archaeological discovery, and the simple fact that Arctic regions remain largely unexplored archaeologically. Sometimes, the simplest explanation isn't the complete explanation. After examining arguments for and against historical Hyperborea, what can we honestly conclude? The answer requires distinguishing between what we know with scientific certainty, what remains uncertain, and what reasonable middle ground exists between extreme positions. Here's what is scientifically certain. Arctic and subarctic regions experienced significantly warmer periods during the past 15,000 years, particularly during the Holocene climate optimum. This isn't speculation, it's established paleoclimatology. Humans inhabited Arctic regions earlier and more extensively than scholars believed even 20 years ago. Archaeological discoveries continue pushing back the dates of human Arctic presence. Sophisticated indigenous Arctic cultures existed and achieved remarkable adaptations to extreme environments. Climate catastrophes did force population movements and cultural disruptions throughout prehistory. This pattern appears repeatedly in the archaeological and geological record. Some oral traditions preserve accurate historical information across millennia, as archaeology has repeatedly confirmed. Ancient sources from multiple cultures describe northern homelands with consistent features, even when those cultures had no known contact. But here's what remains uncertain. We don't know whether Arctic warm periods allowed development of what we would define as advanced civilization cities, writing systems, monumental architecture, complex social hierarchies, or only smaller-scale sophisticated cultures. We can't determine definitively whether cross-cultural similarities in polar paradise myths indicate shared memory of an actual place, common Indo-European mythological inheritance, or independent invention by separate cultures. The claimed anomalous structures in Arctic regions remain controversial. Are they artificial constructions, natural formations, or misidentified conventional archaeological sites? Whether knowledge appearing in ancient southern cultures derived from northern influences, independent indigenous development, or other sources entirely remains an open question. Given these certainties and uncertainties, reasonable middle ground positions emerge. It's plausible that sophisticated Arctic and subarctic cultures existed during warm periods, achieved significant knowledge, particularly in astronomy and navigation, necessitated by their environment, and were displaced by climate deterioration. It's possible that these displaced populations influenced southern cultures through refugee movements and cultural transmission, contributing to the knowledge bases of emerging civilizations. It's conceivable that myths about Hyperborea and related northern paradises preserve distorted but genuine memory of these actual cultures, transformed through millennia of oral transmission into idealized mythology. However, extraordinary claims, advanced technology rivaling or exceeding modern capabilities, continent-spanning civilizations, deliberately hidden evidence, lack supporting proof, and should be rejected without better evidence. What should we conclude about ancient knowledge systems based on this investigation? Ancient peoples possessed greater capabilities than mainstream scholarship often credits. Sophisticated, astronomical, navigational, and environmental knowledge could develop in non-agricultural, non-urban societies. Oral traditions can preserve historical information across vast timescales when maintained by cultures with strong traditions of accurate transmission. Climate has been a major driver of human cultural development and crisis throughout history, a pattern we're only beginning to fully appreciate. The Hyperborea question has practical implications for Arctic archaeology. The region is dramatically understudied compared to other areas of the world. It likely contains significant undiscovered sites that would reshape our understanding of human prehistory. Climate change is simultaneously revealing new sites as ice retreats and destroying evidence through permafrost collapse and coastal erosion. Indigenous knowledge should be seriously engaged as a historical source, rather than dismissed as mere folklore. Funding and research attention should increase dramatically for Arctic archaeological investigation before evidence is permanently lost. This investigation teaches us important lessons about historical interpretation. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly in environments where preservation is challenged by ice, geological activity, and changing sea levels. Mainstream consensus can be correct about general principles, while missing specific details. Mythology and history aren't always clearly separable. Myths can encode historical memory, even as they transform facts into legend. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but plausible claims deserve serious investigation even when unproven. The measured conclusion is this. The case for sophisticated Arctic cultures during warm periods, displaced by climate change, and remembered in mythology, is plausible and worthy of continued investigation. The case for advanced lost civilization on the scale of ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia lacks sufficient supporting evidence. The truth likely lies between pure myth and advanced lost civilization, real Arctic peoples, sophisticated but not superhuman, destroyed by climate catastrophe, remembered imperfectly through millennia, but not invented entirely from imagination. Continued research combining paleoclimatology, archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and indigenous knowledge will progressively clarify the picture. Sometimes, acknowledging uncertainty while continuing to investigate is the most intellectually honest position we can take. Climate doesn't just provide the backdrop for human history, it writes the script. Again and again, when we examine the rise and fall of civilizations, we find climate's invisible hand shaping human destiny in ways that ancient peoples experienced as divine favor or cosmic punishment, but which we can now recognize as natural processes with devastating cultural consequences. Consider the African humid period, which lasted from 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. During this time, the Sahara wasn't a desert. It was savanna, dotted with lakes, home to hippopotamuses and crocodiles, and supporting substantial human populations who left behind rock art depicting their lives in this green Sahara. Then, the climate shifted. The monsoon patterns changed. Within centuries, the verdant landscape became the desert we know today. Those populations vanished, migrated, or died. Their cultures dissolved. Today, their rock art stares out from cliff faces in one of Earth's most inhospitable environments, silent testimony to a world that no longer exists. The medieval warm period allowed Norse populations to expand into Greenland, establishing settlements that thrived for generations. These weren't desperate outposts, they were functioning communities with churches, farms, and trade connections to Europe. Then came the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened, sea ice expanded. By the 15th century, the settlements were abandoned. The Norse didn't fail because they were primitive or incompetent. They failed because their civilization was optimized for climate conditions that no longer existed. 4,200 years ago, something caused Bronze Age civilizations across multiple continents to collapse nearly simultaneously. Egypt's Old Kingdom fell. The Akkadian Empire dissolved. Indus Valley cities were abandoned. Current evidence suggests a climate event, severe drought lasting decades as the trigger. Civilizations that had persisted for centuries couldn't survive the disruption to water supplies and agriculture. Even earlier, the Younger Dryas brought sudden cold that may have disrupted or destroyed cultures we know little about. Civilizations that might have been developing during the warming that preceded it, only to be erased when ice returned. The pattern repeats across human history. Populations expand into regions during favorable climate periods. They develop cultures adapted to those conditions, building techniques suited to the climate, agricultural practices matched to rainfall patterns, settlement locations chosen based on resources available under prevailing conditions. Then, climate shifts. What was adaptation becomes maladaptation. Investments become worthless. Knowledge becomes obsolete. Populations face catastrophic displacement. This pattern extends beyond Hyperborea. Flood myths appear in cultures worldwide, often with remarkable consistency and detail. These might preserve memory of post-glacial sea level rise that drowned coastal settlements where humans had lived for generations. Desert legends describing lost cities might remember Saharan cultures that existed during humid periods. Stories of golden ages frequently coincide with known periods of climate optimum, suggesting these aren't just wishful thinking but distorted memory of actually better conditions. Climate catastrophe is particularly destructive culturally because it forces abandonment of investment. Settlements built over generations must be left behind. Modified landscapes, terraced hillsides, irrigation systems, cleared forests become useless. Accumulated local knowledge about weather patterns, resource locations, and optimal practices loses relevance in new environments. Populations disperse, breaking social networks and knowledge transmission systems. The catastrophe can happen quickly enough to seem like divine punishment rather than understandable natural process, creating trauma that echoes through mythology for millennia. Refugees from climate catastrophe arrive in new regions as both skilled contributors and potential competitors, creating complex cultural dynamics. They bring knowledge and capabilities, but also need resources. They might be welcomed, absorbed, enslaved, or fought against. Their influence on host cultures varies tremendously depending on circumstances. This reframes how we understand civilization itself. We tend to think of civilization as progressive accumulation, each generation building on the previous, knowledge and capability steadily increasing. But climate reveals civilization can be circular. Populations advance during favorable periods, retreat during catastrophes, then re-advance from the remnants. The archaeological record is biased toward what survived in favorable preservation contexts. We're missing civilizations that existed in regions later scoured by ice, drowned by rising seas, or buried under advancing deserts. We're living through climate shift comparable to past catastrophic changes. Modern civilization, like hypothetical Arctic civilization, is adapted to specific climate conditions that are changing. Our agricultural systems, our cities, our infrastructure, our economic arrangements, all optimized for the Holocene climate that has prevailed for the past 10,000 years. That climate is changing. We face the same choice ancient peoples did: adapt successfully, migrate in an orderly fashion, or face cultural disruption. Our knowledge systems might or might not survive the transition intact. Future peoples might discover our abandoned coastal cities in changed landscapes and wonder what happened to us, just as we wonder about Hyperborea. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes across the millennia. We know the formula for Roman concrete now, but we lost it for over 1,000 years. Rome fell in 476 CE, leaving behind structures like the Pantheon, with its vast, unreinforced concrete dome that still stands after 2 millennia. Yet by the Middle Ages, Europeans had forgotten how to make concrete that could match Roman quality. The knowledge simply vanished. Only recently, through analyzing ancient structures at the molecular level, have we rediscovered what was lost. Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon, burned on water and couldn't be extinguished by conventional means. It terrified enemies and may have saved Constantinople from multiple sieges. The formula was so carefully guarded that when the empire finally fell, the knowledge died with it. We still don't know exactly what Greek fire was. Damascus steel, renowned for its strength and distinctive wavy patterns, came from techniques developed over centuries. Then, sometime around the 18th century, the knowledge of how to produce true Damascus steel vanished. Modern metallurgists have theories and can create similar materials, but the original process remains mysterious. These examples teach uncomfortable lessons. Knowledge can be lost even in literate civilizations with institutional support. Practical techniques can vanish when the craftspeople who know them die without adequately training successors. Theoretical understanding can disappear, while physical evidence, structures, artifacts, patterns persists, creating mysteries for future generations. Knowledge loss often occurs during disruption: conquest, epidemic, economic collapse, climate catastrophe. Different types of knowledge have different vulnerabilities. Explicit knowledge written down, systematically taught, with multiple copies distributed, widely survives best, but only if writing systems remain readable and texts are preserved. The knowledge in Egyptian hieroglyphs was lost for over 1,000 years, until the Rosetta Stone provided the key to decipherment. All those texts existed, but the knowledge they contained was inaccessible. Tacit knowledge learned by doing, transmitted through apprenticeship, understood through experience rather than instruction, is more vulnerable. When practice communities disperse, when masters die without adequate students, when economic or social disruption prevents the years of training required to develop expertise, tacit knowledge vanishes. This is how we lost Roman concrete, Damascus steel, and countless other capabilities. Embedded knowledge, encoded in structures, tools, cultural practices can persist without understanding. Stonehenge still stands, precisely aligned to astronomical phenomena, but we can only infer what knowledge went into its construction. The builder's understanding is gone, leaving us with the physical result, but not the theoretical framework that produced it. If sophisticated Arctic civilization existed and was destroyed by climate catastrophe, how would knowledge have survived? Refugees carrying explicit knowledge would attempt to preserve it, writing it down, teaching it, passing it on. But without appropriate materials, without students prepared to receive advanced knowledge, without institutions to maintain systematic transmission, much would inevitably be lost. The knowledge that survived best would be practical rather than theoretical. Astronomical observations remain useful regardless of theoretical framework. Navigation techniques work without understanding why they work. Metallurgical processes can be replicated without comprehending the chemistry involved. Knowledge might be encoded in mythology, ritual, and cultural practice, transforming but persisting. A creation myth might preserve memory of migration from the north. A ritual observing celestial events might encode astronomical knowledge. Architectural proportions might reflect mathematical understanding, even when the mathematics itself is forgotten. Physical structures and artifacts would provide templates, showing what was possible, even if original understanding was lost. We have documented examples of knowledge transmission across cultural boundaries and civilizational disruptions. Islamic scholars preserved Greek philosophy during Europe's Dark Ages, maintaining texts and traditions that Europe had lost. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, this knowledge was retransmitted to Europe through Arabic translations, sparking intellectual revolution. Chinese technologies, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, printing reached Europe through multiple transmission chains, often with the theoretical understanding lost in transit. Europeans adopted the practical applications without initially understanding the principles behind them. Indigenous American agricultural knowledge was adopted by European colonizers, while the theoretical understanding behind it, sophisticated knowledge of ecology, soil science, and selective breeding, was dismissed as primitive. The practices persisted, the respect for the knowledge didn't. If Arctic civilization existed and was destroyed, we shouldn't expect neat transfer of complete knowledge systems. We'd expect exactly what we apparently find: fragmented knowledge, practical techniques divorced from theoretical understanding, astronomical or navigational wisdom encoded in myth or ritual, physical evidence outlasting comprehension. Advanced astronomy in ancient cultures might derive from Arctic observations transmitted southward by refugees. Navigational knowledge appearing in societies without obvious need for it could represent northern maritime expertise. Philosophical concepts about cosmic cycles and northern origins might encode degraded memory of actual Arctic intellectual traditions. There's a profound irony here. The very climate catastrophe that makes Hyperborea interesting, creating mythology, forcing knowledge transmission, scattering populations, also destroyed most evidence of its existence. Knowledge transmission across catastrophic breaks is possible, but inherently distorting. What survives is rarely what was most valued. Understanding is lost even when practices persist. Future archaeologists might find our smartphones and have no idea what they were for, just as we find ancient devices and argue about their purpose. We're creating vast digital knowledge repositories, but are they more or less vulnerable than ancient oral traditions? If civilization disruption occurred, what knowledge would survive, and how would future peoples interpret it? The fragmentary persistence of potential Hyperborean knowledge might be exactly what we should expect from a civilization destroyed by climate catastrophe 10,000 years ago. We've lost the recipe for Roman concrete after just 15 centuries. Expecting Arctic textbooks after 10 millennia is absurd. Expecting fragments, myths, puzzles, and knowledge that seems to come from nowhere that's reasonable. Lost civilizations fascinate us in ways that known civilizations rarely do. Egypt is impressive, but it doesn't capture imagination quite like Atlantis. Rome's achievements are well documented, but Hyperborea intrigues us more. Why? What drives this fascination with civilizations that might never have existed, or existed in forms so different from mythology that the connection is tenuous at best? Part of the appeal is obvious. Lost civilizations suggest human achievement was greater than we knew, that wisdom was lost that we might recover, that our current understanding is incomplete. They offer escape from the mundane present into mysterious past. They provide narrative satisfaction, tragedy, mystery, quest for truth. These are the surface motivations, real but not complete. Deeper motivations drive the search. Investigating Hyperborea represents searching for human origins and meaning. Where did we come from? What were our ancestors capable of? How did we become who we are? These questions have always mattered to humans. Every culture has origin stories because understanding the past helps us understand ourselves. The search reflects hope that past civilizations possessed wisdom we've lost, knowledge that might help with current challenges. If ancient peoples understood astronomy better than we thought, navigated by methods we've forgotten, adapted to climate change we're only beginning to face, perhaps their knowledge could guide us now. This hope isn't necessarily naive. We have rediscovered lost knowledge that proved useful. Ancient agricultural techniques, traditional ecological knowledge, historical climate adaptation strategies, all have contemporary relevance. The fascination expresses dissatisfaction with materialist reductionism, the desire to believe there's more to human history than conventional narratives acknowledge. When mainstream scholarship seems overly confident in dismissing possibilities, when academia appears rigid in its consensus, when ancient mysteries are explained away rather than investigated seriously, some people rebel. Not all rebellion is unreasonable. Sometimes consensus is wrong. Sometimes anomalies are dismissed too quickly. Sometimes conventional explanations don't account for all the evidence. But engagement with ancient mysteries can be healthy or unhealthy. Healthy engagement treats these mysteries as intellectual puzzles requiring evidence and reason. It remains open to uncertainty and revision. It appreciates the value of investigation, even when definitive answers remain elusive. It acknowledges when evidence is insufficient. It changes views when new information emerges. Unhealthy engagement uses ancient mysteries to support predetermined ideological positions, racial superiority theories, religious fundamentalism, anti-science conspiracy thinking. It becomes immune to counter-evidence. It values belief over understanding. It sees every challenge as confirmation of persecution, rather than invitation to strengthen arguments. It mistakes criticism for closed-mindedness and demands acceptance of claims without adequate proof. What does serious investigation of Hyperborea offer beyond satisfying curiosity? It expands understanding of human climate adaptations and Arctic archaeology. It validates oral traditions and indigenous knowledge as historical sources deserving serious consideration. It challenges assumptions about primitive peoples and reveals sophisticated capabilities in unexpected contexts. It teaches humility about how much we don't know about the past. It demonstrates how mythology can encode historical memory across vast timescales. Continuing the search means acknowledging that historical understanding is never complete. New discoveries continually revise our picture of the past. 30 years ago, we thought humans reached the Americas 12,000 years ago. Now we have evidence of presence potentially twice that old. 20 years ago, Göbekli Tepe was unknown. Now it forces reconsideration of when humans developed monumental architecture and complex society. 10 years from now, new discoveries will challenge current consensus. This is how knowledge advances. It means recognizing that absence of evidence genuinely is not evidence of absence, particularly in challenging environments like the Arctic, where preservation is difficult and exploration is limited. It means maintaining intellectual openness while requiring evidentiary standards. It means valuing questions even when answers remain uncertain. Throughout this investigation, we've explored ancient sources describing northern paradises. We've examined paleoclimatic evidence of Arctic warm periods, making habitation possible. We've investigated archaeological mysteries and indigenous oral traditions. We've considered technological and knowledge capabilities of ancient peoples. We've synthesized diverse evidence into plausible scenarios while acknowledging uncertainty. Whether specific Hyperborea existed matters less than what investigating the question teaches us about climate's role in shaping civilization, about knowledge transmission across catastrophic disruption, about the sophisticated capabilities of ancient peoples, about the complexity of historical interpretation, and about our own relationship with mystery and past. Somewhere in melting ice, in uncatalogued archives, in indigenous oral traditions, or in archaeological sites not yet discovered, there might be evidence that will answer some of these questions. Until then, we have the fragments, the myths, the mysteries, and the deeply human impulse to understand where we came from and what those who came before us knew. In the end, we search for Hyperborea, not because we expect to find a lost paradise under the ice, but because the search itself reveals something important, that human history is deeper and stranger than we imagined, that our ancestors achieved more than we credited them with, and that every answer opens new questions worth asking.